Before gods walked, before the stars sang their thermonuclear hymns, before even the warp had learned to whisper, there was thought. It came not in flashes nor in flares of evolution, but in stillness, in patience, in intention. The galaxy was quiet, a canvas of gas, dust, and rudimentary life. It spun in silence, unknowing, unwatched. Then they arrived. Or perhaps they awakened. The beings we now call the Old Ones did not crash into existence with a bang. They emerged slowly, imperceptibly, like consciousness blooming inside the mind of the cosmos itself. By the time their presence registered against the deep time background of the galaxy, they were already ancient. Not merely older than any other civilization, but older than civilization as a concept, older than history, older than language. They are not old in the way a mountain is old. They are old in the way gravity is old, fundamental, pre-existing, immeasurable. The truth of their origin is lost, perhaps deliberately. No species remembers the world from which they came. No record names a cradle planet. Even the Eldar, with their obsessive memory and mythologies, have no clear account of where the Old Ones were born. Some suggest they did not come from a world at all, but from a coalescence of thoughts scattered across early star systems. Consciousness formed in parallel, distributed among 100 fertile atmospheres. Others whisper that the Old Ones were never born, that they were placed. A galactic constant like the speed of light. Whatever their true genesis, they came into awareness with power already in hand. Physically, the Old Ones are believed to have been reptilian or amphibious in nature, adaptable, long-lived, and perhaps entirely outside the biological norms we recognize. But form was never their defining trait. They were not dominant because of muscle or weaponry. They ruled not through conquest, but through comprehension. They were the first sentient species to truly understand the galaxy. Not merely to observe, not merely to survive, but to bend reality to purpose. Their minds operated on timescales alien to all others. Where other species would struggle to track seasons or centuries, the Old Ones planned in millennia, mapped the rise and fall of stars, predicted evolution before it began. They saw a cosmic puzzle, vast, unassembled, and set about solving it. And so began the true first age of the galaxy. We know of no war during this time, no rivals, no crises. The Old Ones were alone in thought, and in that solitude, they created meaning. It was not an empire in the conventional sense. There were no borders, no flags, no conquests. But their influence spread, a slow tide of influence and construction. They charted the stars, they catalogued the planets, they studied the laws of the warp while it still slept, calm, reflective, before the thoughts of lesser beings muddied its depths. In this time, the Old Ones began to shape, not to build, but to sculpt. They were gardeners, not kings. They touched the embryonic worlds of the galaxy and helped life flourish where it might have withered. On barren rocks, they seeded the foundations of ecosystems. On unstable planets, they anchored tectonics and tuned atmospheres. On promising worlds, they watched life evolve and occasionally, gently, intervened. But intervention was never reckless. It was a slow hand, subtle and guiding. There was no rush. The Old Ones moved with patience born of timelessness. They understood the value of diversity, the necessity of variation. No single path, no single species, no single solution. Life to them was a web, not a ladder. And all the while they observed. The development of consciousness fascinated them. They studied sentience not as a phenomenon, but as a force, something measurable, something usable. They saw minds as tools, and tools as minds. To them, biology and technology were not separate disciplines. A life form could be engineered as easily as a machine, and a machine could possess a soul if constructed with the right resonance. It is during this period, this quiet golden era, that the first hints of the Old One's immense power emerge in the ruins they left behind. Structures buried in the cores of dead worlds, planetary fields of harmonized gravity, orbs of impossible material, still humming after 60 million years. To us, these are relics. To them, they were components, tools, scribbles in the margins of the great galactic manuscript, and they worked in silence. There are no records of self-aggrandizement, no monuments proclaiming their glory, no propaganda. The Old Ones did not desire worship nor recognition. They were, and that was enough. In later times, this lack of ego would lead many to dismiss them as myths. Surely, if they had been so great, they would have left more to remember them by. But the Old Ones were not interested in being remembered. They were interested in leaving the galaxy better than they found it. Even their creations, those races they are believed to have uplifted or designed, were not bound by gratitude or debt. The Eldar speak of them not as gods, but as distant teachers. The orcs, in their distorted oral tradition, remember brain boys, clever beings who once organized their ancestors. The Jokairo, those mute geniuses, carry instincts too refined to have evolved naturally. Even humanity, so far removed in time, bears echoes of their influence in its latent psychic potential. But none of these species knew the Old Ones as they truly were. None could. To comprehend them fully would be to see time sideways, to think in ecosystems rather than thoughts. They were not a race that demanded interaction. They did not interfere where they were not needed. They did not control, they curated, and then they vanished. Not in a single moment, not in fire, but slowly like stars fading from a night sky. Their presence dwindled, their work, once so pervasive, paused. The great machines fell still, the carefully guided systems ran on without hands, and the galaxy, so lovingly prepared, was left to find its own way. Some say they foresaw their end and accepted it. Some say they left by choice, ascending perhaps to another plane or folding themselves into the webway. Others believe they fragmented themselves into their creations, spreading their essence across 1,000 bloodlines, ensuring that no matter what came after, something of their will would endure. We do not know, but we know this. Before the first dawn broke across the surface of any sentient world, the Old Ones had already walked beneath the stars. They had already built, already dreamed, already decided the shape of things to come. They were not the first rulers of the galaxy. They were its first custodians. And in their long silence, they taught a lesson no empire has since remembered, that true power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it plants, and sometimes it simply walks away. They had no need for conquest. There were no enemies to repel, no neighbors to outpace, no desperate scrabble for territory. The galaxy was vast, endlessly so, and silent. And into that silence the Old Ones expanded. Not as an empire, not with legions or war machines, but as a civilization of intention. Their spread was not a rush but a rhythm, a slow, deliberate blooming across the stars. To lesser beings, expansion is a symptom of hunger, resource-driven, strategic, always under pressure. But the Old Ones moved without haste. They did not expand to dominate, they expanded to understand. They studied each system like a scholar poring over ancient texts. When they came upon a new planet, they did not strip it. They mapped its geochemistry, studied its orbit, traced the migration of its tectonic plates. They observed not as conquerors, but as curators of cosmic possibility. In time, their presence could be found across nearly every quadrant of the galaxy. Their reach spanned nebulae, encompassed globular clusters, and pierced the farthest edges of spiral arms. Not through colonies or territorial claims, but through nodes of presence, installations, observation posts, sanctuaries, and waystations of impossible design. On some worlds, they terraformed, but even this term falls short of their subtlety. The Old Ones did not terraform the way others would, they tuned. They realigned magnetic poles, coaxed atmospheres into stability, introduced specific microbial matrices that would, over millennia, create fertile soils and oxygen-rich skies. They knew that true change happened not in bursts, but in harmonies. Wherever they settled, they did so in accordance with the needs of the environment, not in defiance of it. They did not impose their architecture upon the world like a scar, but wove it into the land, structures hidden within mountain veins, energy nexuses placed at fault lines to stabilize planetary drift, cities that pulsed with planetary rhythms whose very presence helped the world breathe more steadily. Their buildings, if they can even be called that, were not always visible. Often the only sign of their presence was an irregularity, a perfect stone in an imperfect canyon, a humming vibration beneath the soil, a curious alignment of moons that seemed to follow artificial logic. Entire biomes may have been under their guidance without any surface-dwelling species ever realizing it. On some worlds, they simply observed. Perhaps they were waiting to see if life would emerge unaided. Perhaps they were watching for specific conditions, markers of some deeper cosmic pattern they understood, and no one else did. Observation was as important to them as creation. Not every seed needs planting. Some merely need time. Their presence was not centralized. There was no throne world, no capital, no galactic center of authority. The Old Ones seemed to favor a distributed civilization, a network, not a pyramid. Each outpost was both independent and interconnected, a node in a lattice of knowledge and influence. Decisions were likely made by consensus, if they were made at all. It's possible each Old One acted independently, guided by shared principles rather than command structures. This decentralized model allowed them to spread without losing cohesion. No single loss could cripple them. No threat could decapitate their society, because there was no head to remove. This design philosophy extended into the webway, the vast transdimensional network of corridors and portals the Old Ones began constructing during this period. While the webway deserves its own chapter, and will have it, it's worth noting here that its expansion mirrored their physical one. It was not simply a means of travel, it was an extension of themselves. As they expanded through real space, so too did they chart paths through the immaterium, creating safe, stable corridors that linked their far-flung sanctuaries. In this age of expansion, they encountered life, primitive, disorganized, but promising. Many worlds were home to developing organisms or conditions ripe for sentience to emerge. The Old Ones did not always interfere, often they simply watched. But when a species showed potential or danger, they would act. They began the work of seeding and sculpting. Some species were gifted genetic nudges, others were subtly altered at the microbial level, their evolutionary path rerouted to ensure intelligence would bloom within a certain time frame. The Old Ones didn't create life purely for aesthetics. They weren't collectors. They were investors in potential. Why? What was their ultimate goal? That question has haunted xenologists, psychers, and rogue scholars across millennia. Some argue they sought to create a galaxy of psychic resonance, a web of sentient minds that could act as a counterbalance to the chaotic tides of the warp. Others suggest they were trying to understand the limits of consciousness by creating a million different versions of it. And some, the more radical thinkers, believe the Old Ones were building a galactic organism, with each species as a cell, each world a neuron, meant to harmonize into a unified psychic whole. Whatever their aim, their reach only grew. They were not always visible, even when present. There are records, fragmentary, dreamlike, of early species who saw the Old Ones as wraiths or spirits, beings that appeared only at thresholds of great change. Some called them watchers, others teachers. Always they arrived in moments of transformation, and always they departed before questions could be asked. To most, their work was incomprehensible, but not cruel. The Old Ones were never described as tyrants nor manipulators. Their influence came not from domination, but from presence, subtle, deliberate, and transformative. Even their technology, if one can separate it from their biology, their thought, their psychic resonance, was so far beyond any known classification that calling it advanced does it a disservice. It was elegant inevitability. Tools that responded to thought, structures that hummed in alignment with star charts, devices that shifted shape depending on who touched them. Some of these relics still exist, buried in the bones of the galaxy. Ancient archaeo-xeno vaults, harmonic engines, crystalline interfaces that defy scanning. But most are dead, not destroyed, simply dormant, waiting perhaps for a command that will never come. And still the Old Ones expanded. They did not name their holdings. They did not write laws. They left no centralized doctrine, no universal language. Their civilization was one of principles, not prescriptions. Wherever they went, they followed the same quiet tenets. Observe, encourage, harmonize, and retreat. Never interfere unless necessary. Never control what can grow on its own. Never linger after the lesson is learned. Their expansion was the closest thing the galaxy has ever seen to a benevolent omnipresence. They were everywhere, and yet nowhere. They did not shape the galaxy in their image. They shaped it so that it could find its own image. This was their golden era, not of rule, but of revelation. A time when the stars were not battlegrounds, but laboratories. When planets were not prizes but possibilities, when life was not something to be exploited, but something to be understood. And through it all, they did not name themselves gods. They were architects, not of empires, but of futures. And as they moved ever outward, the galaxy followed their footsteps, unknowingly walking into a design that would shape all things to come. There are roads that wind through mountains, roads that stretch between stars, and then there are roads that run beneath reality itself. These were the webway paths, neither tunnel nor portal, but something altogether stranger, something older, not a feat of infrastructure, but a reshaping of metaphysical law. They were the arteries of the Old One's domain, and perhaps their greatest and most dangerous achievement. Even now, in the waning light of the 41st millennium, the webway remains incomprehensible to all but a few. It is not simply a way to travel. It is a place, a realm, a network woven into the skin between real space and the warp. Not quite in either, but touching both. A hidden dimension that once pulsed with activity, now mostly silent, like a deserted city still echoing with the footsteps of its architects. The Old Ones did not simply invent the webway. They did not stumble upon it, nor carve it with brute force. They coaxed it into being as one might coax a vine to grow along a trellis. They had long studied the immaterium, back when it was still quiet, still reflective, before it was stained by thought, by pain, by the turbulence of lesser minds. The warp then was more like a calm sea, unfathomable but serene. And the Old Ones, with their immense psychic prowess and scientific mastery, learned how to chart it, not sail its currents as humans do, but step alongside them. This is what made the webway so unique. It didn't use the warp, it ran beside it, a shadow realm that could be entered and exited only with precise psychic calibration and anchoring technology far beyond even today's understanding. This was not travel through chaos, it was travel through a structure outside chaos, held together by will, geometry, and a kind of resonance known only to the Old Ones. The first webway passages were likely experiments, short jumps between two stable points, safe zones established in warp-shadowed space, tethered by psychic beacons. These passages were humble, local, measured, but as their knowledge grew, so too did their ambition. They began weaving entire routes through this liminal dimension, routes that could carry them across vast swaths of the galaxy in the blink of an eye. Each new path was a triumph of engineering and metaphysics, stitched into existence with care, caution, and sublime complexity. These corridors were immune to time dilation, to warp tides, to demonic interference, perfect, silent expressways hidden behind the veil of reality. In time, the webway became not just a travel network, but an extension of their civilization. It connected their outposts, their laboratories, their biodomes, and observation sanctuaries. But more than that, it connected their minds. The Old Ones were not bound by linearity. They did not think in singular systems. The webway allowed them to experience a kind of distributed existence, where memory, data, and presence could flow across light years without interruption. It was the nervous system of a species that no longer needed to move physically to influence distant worlds, and within it, they built cities, not like those found on worlds of stone and sky. These were impossible constructs, woven into the fabric of the webway itself, realities nested within realities. Some were vast libraries of encoded psychic knowledge, accessible only by thought. Others were training grounds for entities that never walked in real space. Some, perhaps, were habitats, not for the Old Ones themselves, but for the concepts they wished to preserve. Even among the Eldari, who inherited fragments of this wondrous realm, these deeper sectors are considered forbidden. Their gates remain sealed with symbols no living mind can interpret, and yet they remain active, still humming, still watching. The architecture of the webway was as varied as the Old Ones themselves. No two entrances were alike. Some were ornate portals hidden beneath mountains, wrapped in vines that responded to sentient presence. Others were crystalline arches floating in deep space, invisible until approached with the correct harmonic frequency. Some were living gateways, creatures shaped by design, whose very being formed the threshold between realms. To step through them was not just travel, but transformation. Access required more than coordinates. One needed alignment, identity, intent. The webway responded not only to location, but to who you were, and sometimes why. This makes sense when viewed through the lens of the Old Ones' broader ideology. They were not a species of convenience. They did not build for the sake of speed. The webway was not a road to power. It was a test of worthiness, a way to ensure that only those properly attuned, mentally, psychically, philosophically, could move through the deep arteries of creation. It's worth emphasizing. The webway was not meant for the masses. It was not public infrastructure. It was sacred, secret. A gift shared only with those the Old Ones trusted implicitly, most notably their psychically gifted creations. The Eldar were one such race. Birthed to be powerful in mind and soul, they were granted access to the outer layers of the webway, taught how to enter and exit without harm. The Orcs, or rather their ancient forerunners, the Krork, were never given this gift. Their role in the Old Ones' cosmic design was of a different nature. The Jorkairo? Too alien in behavior, too unpredictable. And humanity? Well, they were never ready. But make no mistake, the webway was the central thread in the Old Ones' vision for a united galaxy. Not politically united, not militarily, but spiritually, psychically, a lattice of consciousness and connection. Through the webway, not only could species interact, but synchronize, share understanding, cross-pollinate without erasing identity. It was their answer to distance, to isolation, to misunderstanding, And yet, as with all great tools, its beauty was matched by its danger. The webway was never meant to withstand hatred. It was built in a time of calm, a time when the warp was still a sleeping ocean. But as sentience spread, and with it, pain, loss, rage, the warp began to change. The sea turned stormy, shadows stirred, the pressure against the webway's walls began to mount. The old ones, ever-wise, reinforced it where they could, sealed off vulnerable regions, created psychic locks and anti-demonic barriers. But they could not halt the tide forever. They had never built the webway to contain chaos, only to avoid it. And this would prove a vulnerability, a lesson perhaps in hubris, not of ambition but of optimism. Still, while it endured, the webway was unmatched. It allowed the old ones to be present without presence, to be anywhere, anytime, without intrusion. It allowed species separated by millions of light years to work in harmony. It allowed knowledge to move faster than thought. And now it lies mostly silent. The Eldar still use fragments of it, though even they fear its deeper tunnels. Human scientists, the few brave or foolish enough to attempt entry, are repelled or destroyed by its complexity. The Necrons, once denied it, now seek its secrets in vain. And chaos. Chaos watches from the edges, eager for cracks. But deep within, beneath the silence, some of the old ones' paths still remain untouched. There are corridors that have not echoed with footsteps for 60 million years. Vaults that still wait for their keys. Doors that will open only for minds that remember what it means to build, not to rule. The webway was not just a means of travel. It was the manifestation of hope, the embodiment of a vision, that one could move through the galaxy not as a conqueror, but as a participant, linked not by domination, but by understanding. And though its builders are gone, the paths remain, waiting, watching, perhaps remembering. Long before genetic manipulation became the whispered obsession of the Adeptus Mechanicus, long before the flesh forges of the Dark Eldar or the grotesque cloning pits of forbidden Xenos worlds, the Old Ones had already rewritten the very definition of life. To call them scientists would be to diminish the scale of their achievement. They were not engineers tinkering with genomes in sterile laboratories. They were composers, writing living symphonies in cell and sinew. They were architects, designing ecosystems as deliberately as they constructed their vast webway. And they were artists, shaping evolution not for war, not for profit, but for balance. Biology for the Old Ones was not a fixed code. It was a toolkit, a language, one they had mastered so completely that the distinction between organism and machine, between natural and synthetic, between creature and concept, became meaningless. They could conjure life not from dead matter, but from principle, from understanding what a being needed to become and building backwards from that destination. But this mastery was not wielded recklessly. The Old Ones were never careless creators. They did not play God. They were godlike, but they created not from ego but from intention. Each act of biogenesis was calibrated, calculated, contextualized. No two worlds bore the same life. No two ecosystems evolved along the same path. Each was a living experiment, a lesson, a variable in a vast galactic equation only the Old Ones understood in full. Consider for a moment the complexity of this task. Creating a life form is not merely a question of flesh. It is a question of interaction, of environment, of ecological rhythm. To introduce a species into a world without unbalancing it, this was the true art of the Old Ones. They did not build apex predators to dominate ecosystems, but to stabilize them. They did not uplift species to intelligence without also creating symbiotic systems to sustain their culture. A desert world might receive a species with silicon-based lungs, capable of filtering crystalline dust for nourishment. On a gas giant's moons, they might encourage photosensitive algae to bloom beneath ice sheets, forming the base of a food chain so efficient it bordered on perpetual motion. Jungle planets were shaped into layered biomes, creatures living not just beside one another, but within one another's cycles, locked into delicate patterns of shared existence. And the intelligent species? Those are the ones we remember. The Eldar, gifted with extraordinary psychic sensitivity, designed not merely to think, but to feel the warp, subtle currents of thought and emotion rippling through their souls from birth. Every fiber of their being was a conduit for communion with one another and with the immaterium itself. The Krork, not yet the simple, brawling orcs we know today, were a species of biological warfare perfected. Adaptive, regenerative, collective in psychology, but individualized in skill. They were forged for survival, not savagery. They were meant to defend what the Old Ones had nurtured, not to rampage across it. The Jokero, quiet geniuses of simian shape, may have been designed not for battle or worship, but for maintenance. Their instinctive understanding of machinery, their seemingly random but precise technological behavior, hints at a role as caretakers of devices too complex for most biological minds. They do not invent, they remember genetically. They may have been built to inherit the forgotten. Even humanity, though unproven during the height of the Old Ones' era, bears markers in its psychic potential and adaptability that suggest interference. Some scholars within the Ordo Xenos whisper, quietly and only behind sealed doors, that the Old Ones seeded early Terran life as part of a long experiment in resilience. Not to make us dominant, but to make us endure. But the Old Ones did not simply create species. They guided them. They embedded languages into instinct, emotional structures into social interaction, memory into the shape of bones and organs. On some worlds, they wrote morality into genetic drives. On others, they gave only logic, cold and crystalline, to see what kind of civilization might emerge without empathy. They were not reckless. They were curious. In their care, evolution was never left to chance. It was directed, not in every detail, but like a river gently redirected by stones. Let it flow, let it grow, but always within channels that lead somewhere meaningful. They did not rule these species. They did not demand gratitude. Often, the ones they created or uplifted never even saw them. Perhaps a vision here, a visitation there, interpreted later as myth or deity or dream. The Old Ones did not need recognition. They needed results. It is likely they even built fail-safes into their creations. Behavioral limits, psychological governors, psychic feedback loops that prevented certain emotions or thoughts from reaching dangerous extremes. Some posit that the orcs' constant urge to fight is not a flaw, but a regulatory measure, conflict as a means of internal population control. Others believe the Eldar's susceptibility to excess was a sign of failed dampening protocols, an overload of psychic energy gone unfiltered. Not all creations were sentient in the way we understand. The Old Ones sculpted life forms for function, engineered flora that could detect warp fluctuations and release spores to cancel psychic bleed. Beast herders of gigantic, multi-limbed fauna, bred not for war but for atmospheric filtration. On dead moons, they may have seeded microbial intelligences that communicated through magnetic fields. A slow, sprawling consciousness that understood time in centuries, not seconds. They even created intermediaries, bioconstructs designed to interact with the species they shaped. Neither fully machine nor organism, these entities acted as guides or perhaps custodians in places where the Old Ones no longer needed to walk. The more we uncover of their biology, the more we realize how limited our own understanding remains. The Old Ones created not in binary, but in spectra. A creature might be 60% organic, 30% energy-bound plasma life form, and 10% conceptual behavior pattern, anchored in localized psychic field harmonics. To dissect such a being is to miss the point. It is not assembled, it is woven. And this raises the deepest question of all. What was the purpose? Why seed life in such abundance? Why diversify, enrich, and empower when no known threat existed at the time? The answer may lie in their broader cosmology. The Old Ones were not merely architects of life. They were attempting to create a galactic equilibrium, a living, self-sustaining network of species, ecosystems, and psychic resonance that could collectively resist entropy. Not just biological entropy, but spiritual entropy. The creeping chaos of the warp, the decay of meaning, of unity, of hope. Life for the Old Ones was not just matter animated by energy. It was a defense against the unraveling of order itself. Each species they shaped was a different note in a great psychic symphony, meant to push back against the storm they knew was coming. Some believe they failed, others believe they succeeded too well, that their creations became so potent, so unpredictable, that they set off the very cataclysms they hoped to avoid. But that is another story. For now, let us remember them as they were in this chapter of time. Not warriors, not rulers, but life-givers, beings who saw the raw material of a lifeless galaxy and chose not to dominate it, but to nurture it, to turn void into variety, sterility into sentience, chaos into composition. They were the masters of the biogenetic arts, and we, every living species that walks, flies, swims, or thinks, are their legacy. There is a difference between building and growing. The former is an act of control, a projection of will, of design, of the architect forcing material into shape. The latter requires patience, trust, an understanding that growth cannot be rushed, only guided. The Old Ones were not mere builders of civilizations, they were gardeners of galaxies. Their art did not begin with intelligent species. It began with silence, with rocks tumbling through space, barren moons, gas giants boiling beneath lethal pressure. Where others would see emptiness, the Old Ones saw canvas. The potential not for occupation but for transformation. They were not content to simply settle on suitable worlds. No, such passive selection would have been beneath their intent. The Old Ones made planets suitable, and where no such suitability could exist, they forged balance into being. They did not terraform in the primitive, destructive way that the Imperium attempts, flooding planets with atmosphere converters and orbital igniters, flattening unique ecosystems to replicate the comforts of Terra. The Old Ones terraformed like poets, rewriting a language to make it sing, with finesse, with intuition, with cosmic literacy. They understood each star's rhythms, each planet's chemical personality. A world rich in volcanic activity was not a problem to be corrected, but a challenge to harmonize. They encouraged photosynthetic bacteria to thrive in sulfur-rich vents, encouraged fungal megaflora to evolve in tandem with geysers and ash. Over centuries, or minutes depending on their intent, they converted chaos into living potential. Their methods remain beyond comprehension. Some worlds bear planetary crusts subtly etched with sigils that align with star patterns, generating harmonic resonance that stabilizes weather. Others have underground organisms engineered to regulate tectonic movement, ensuring continents never crash, only glide. Some gas giants possess intelligent clouds, massive, sentient vapor forms whose sole purpose is to regulate atmospheric density, keeping pressure and storms in check. These are not random acts of power. They are systemic, precise, deliberate. But the Old Ones did not stop with world-shaping. Once a planet reached equilibrium, they turned their attention to life. Not life as an end goal, but as an ecosystem. a process. They populated their worlds with layered organisms designed to develop together. A common theme across seeded worlds is the triadic ecological model, a structure where three cornerstone species form the basis of a world's biosphere: one to stabilize energy flow, often flora or photosynthetic; one to manage decay and renewal, decomposer species; and one to moderate interaction between the two, often an omnivorous or migratory creature. From this foundation, everything else blossomed. On ocean worlds, these triads might be luminous coral forests, vast filter-feeding leviathans, and schools of reef-tending fish with collective neural networks. On arid planets, they might be root-linked cacti that share water data, slow-moving predators that regulate overpopulation, and burrowing scavengers that compost the dead back into usable mineral blends. And all of this before intelligence. The Old Ones were rarely in a rush to uplift sentience. They watched first, observed, let the planet speak its evolutionary intentions. Only when a species demonstrated adaptability, cohesion, or spiritual intuition would they intervene. That intervention was never singular. They did not choose a species. They layered them. Often, multiple sapient-capable species were cultivated on the same world, but with different functions. One might be physically dominant, another socially specialized. A third might possess an innate psychic frequency that aligned with local planetary ley lines or webway nodes. The Old Ones designed these civilizations to grow together, not in competition, but in symbiosis. Examples of this theory persist even in the shattered records of the Eldar. Ancient myths speak of early worlds where the thinkers, the watchers, and the makers all held different roles within a society, each race dependent on the others, none dominant. What's more astonishing is how these seeded civilizations interacted with their environment. Old One-designed worlds often reveal feedback loops between species and biosphere. One intelligent race might exhale pheromones that affect the germination of forest canopies. Another might have evolved the instinct to arrange crystal formations in patterns that stabilize ambient psychic fields, an act of religion to them, but of geomantic engineering to the Old Ones. This level of interdependence suggests a design philosophy far beyond control. The Old Ones didn't want to govern ecosystems. They wanted them to govern themselves, to become self-aware networks, living planetary intelligences made up not of individuals, but of shared purpose. And they succeeded. For a time, across the galaxy, entire systems thrived, each a different answer to the question, what can life become? Some planets developed into fully realized psychic eco-webs, where the planet's surface acted as a neurological mesh, relaying signals from trees to rivers to beasts to sentient species. Others became bastions of cultural experimentation, worlds where art, language, and philosophy were embedded into the genome itself, each generation remembering not just facts, but meaning. In time, certain species were elevated even further, not through genetic enhancement, but through environmental resonance. When a civilization reached a threshold of harmony, the Old Ones would introduce subtle new variables: a moon with odd magnetic fields, a dormant crystalline obelisk, a low-frequency pulse embedded in rainfall. These additions were not commands, they were invitations. Ascend, they seemed to say. Evolve. Choose to become more. Some did, others did not. The Old Ones did not force the issue. For all their power, they seemed content to let life refuse greatness if it was not ready. In that refusal, too, was data, possibility. Their gardening was not without its darker aspects. On certain worlds, life was removed. Species that proved too unstable, too self-destructive, or too hostile to integration were culled, not with violence, but with surgical finality. A virus encoded into the wind, a chemical in the rain, a sudden psychic silence. The garden was sacred. Weeds were not allowed to strangle the roots of the great design. But even this was not cruelty. It was pruning. Mercy, perhaps, viewed through the lens of eternal stewardship. Then, of course, there were the guardian species. Some planets were seeded not with civilizations, but with protectors, vast, brutish creatures of impossible resilience, designed not to think, but to watch, to wait. These biological titans, precursors perhaps to what we now call the Carnosaurian forms or the megafauna xenoforms, were created to defend key biospheres, webway nodes, or knowledge vaults. Their role was singular: preserve the ecosystem. Even if the thinking species failed, we still find remnants of these garden guardians on forgotten worlds, fossils that do not match any known evolutionary tree. Bioconstructs with synthetic collagen and regenerative abilities that have persisted long after the old ones vanished. And finally, there is the question of pattern. Across all these seeded worlds, across every species shaped or stewarded, there runs a strange consistency, something few dare to speak aloud. A rhythm, a symbol, a subtle spiral of design principles, from molecular biology to architecture, from emotional cognition to ecological engineering. Some xenoarchaeologists believe this repeating pattern was the Old One's signature, a sort of encrypted master code that, if decoded, might reveal the purpose behind all their work. Others suggest it is something more profound, not a code, but a message. A long-form statement spoken across 100 million years, not to us, not even to their creations, but to themselves, a galactic meditation on existence, encoded into the very roots of life. We may never know, but what is clear is this: the Old Ones did not merely seed worlds with life, they seeded them with meaning. Each world a verse, each species a stanza, and together they wrote a poem across the stars, one we are only just beginning to read. If the Old Ones were defined by anything more than their staggering technological achievements or their manipulation of life itself, it was the structure of their thought. Not how they engineered, not how they created, but how they conceived of the galaxy and their place in it. They were not beings of impulse or urgency. There is no record, no myth, no artifact, no ruin that suggests they rushed anything. Their work, their expansion, their influence across the stars was deliberate, methodical, unfolding over spans of time that would break the minds of younger species. To understand them, we must first abandon any notion of time as a constraint. The Old Ones lived for what were, by all accounts, geological epochs. An individual may have persisted for millions of years through environmental collapse, planetary drift, or even entire galactic rotations, unchanged in form, evolving only in perspective. For a being with such endurance, patience was not a virtue, it was the natural state of existence. This longevity shaped everything about their philosophy. They did not seek fast results. They planned across eons. They could begin shaping a biosphere with the full knowledge that its most intelligent species would not emerge for another 100 million years. And still, they would wait, because they understood that outcomes mattered more than speed, and that time was not an enemy. What drove them then, if not conquest or urgency? It appears the Old Ones operated from a worldview based on preservation, balance, and resilience. Their creations were not made to be dependent. Their systems were designed to sustain themselves. This is evident not only in their manipulation of biology, but in the subtle way they seem to have built systems that could survive their own absence. On countless worlds, we find remnants of Old One influence still functioning, self-repairing ecosystems, autonomous energy fields, even behavioral triggers encoded into species instincts that continue to operate long after their creators vanished. This isn't neglect, it's design. The Old Ones did not aim to rule forever. They planned for what would come after them. That speaks to a different kind of intelligence. One that is not obsessed with control, but with endurance. Not about placing themselves at the center of the galaxy, but stepping aside so others could fill that space if they were ready. This belief in self-sufficiency is also reflected in their lack of central authority. There is no evidence of a throne world, no empire of bureaucracy or conquest. Instead, they appear to have functioned in decentralized networks, loosely connected, but ideologically unified. If there was a leader, it was not a ruler. It was a coordinator, a steward, not a sovereign. It's likely that the Old Ones didn't need formal governance. Their decisions may have been made through consensus or shared understanding, possibly through psychic communication, so refined that misunderstanding was impossible. There was no need for debate if everyone simply knew what must be done, which brings us to the warp. The Old Ones were among the first, if not the first, to tap into the immaterium, not as a source of power, but as a field of information, intuition, and connectivity. At that time, the warp was not the seething nightmare it is now. It was calm, mostly unformed, with only the faintest echo of sentient emotion. The Old Ones moved through it with precision. They studied its properties, built conduits like the webway to harness its consistency, and created species that could interface with it without corrupting it. To them, the warp was not a danger. It was an instrument, a dimension of potential. But they were cautious. Even in those early days, the Old Ones knew that the warp responded to emotion. They never used it to channel fear or rage or greed. Instead, they developed species that were attuned to empathy, to cooperation, to collective memory. This was not accident. It was ideology. The Old Ones appeared to believe that consciousness itself was a stabilizing force, that sentient life, if properly guided, could influence reality in a way that preserved rather than eroded. This wasn't utopian idealism, it was strategy. In creating civilizations designed around shared psychic harmony, they may have been trying to prevent something, some event or emergent danger, from rising unchecked. They were preparing the galaxy not for domination but for defense. From what? That remains uncertain. Some scholars speculate the Old Ones foresaw the eventual corruption of the warp, that as more species emerged and more minds filled the immaterium with suffering and ambition, the tides would shift. The calm sea would become a storm, and in that storm something else would be born. Perhaps they were trying to prevent it, or perhaps they knew it was inevitable and simply worked to mitigate the damage. This long-view thinking is what separated them from almost every other race that followed. While most civilizations burn bright and fast, building empires on the backs of their dead, the Old Ones cultivated permanence. They didn't just guide life, they ensured it could recover. When they created a species, they often created backups, related subspecies or adaptive mutations held in reserve, ready to evolve should catastrophe wipe out the primary line. This reveals a chilling foresight. They expected failure, not just as a possibility but as a certainty. It was not pessimism but preparation. Even their silence, their eventual disappearance, seems to reflect a deeper logic. They didn't make monuments to themselves. They didn't leave propaganda. Their artifacts are functional, not ceremonial. Their ruins whisper information, not legacy. It's as if they expected to be forgotten and were fine with it. Because survival, not memory, was the point. The Old Ones weren't interested in being worshipped. That's why so few species even know they were created. Why there are no relics declaring divine authorship. The Old Ones didn't want loyalty. They wanted strength, autonomy, wisdom, and above all, continuity. This is perhaps the greatest insight into their mindset, that they were not driven by the need to leave a mark, but by the need to ensure the galaxy didn't collapse in their absence. That life would go on, with or without them. It's hard for younger species to imagine that kind of thinking. We build for the next year, the next generation. They built for the next age. Their thoughts weren't confined to the now or the near future. They considered the consequences of species 100 million years hence. If they had a guiding principle, it may have been this: existence must persist, not as it is, but as it can become. To them, the galaxy was not a kingdom. It was not a stage. It was a continuum, a living, growing, adapting system of minds, worlds, and energies. Their role wasn't to rule it, but to set it on a path where it could eventually rule itself. And if that meant fading from memory, so be it. The Old Ones weren't gods. They were guardians of the possible. And in every functioning ecosystem, in every surviving species, in every ancient device still quietly doing its work beneath the soil of forgotten planets, their thoughts remain, not in monuments, but in momentum. Most civilizations grow by the blade. Their histories are marked by conquest, hierarchy, suppression, the expansion of control wrapped in the illusion of progress. Empires, from the smallest planetary alliances to the galaxy-spanning dominions of the future, often confuse domination with stability. They equate unity with obedience, and they fall again and again to the same cycle of rebellion and ruin. The Old Ones did none of this. They built an empire, if that word even applies to what they created, without armies of subjugation, without thrones, without creeds. No banners flew above their cities. No imperial cults enforced compliance. There were no prisons, no decrees, no currency. And yet, across hundreds of thousands of worlds, their influence remained cohesive, synchronized, and most of all, resilient. This was not accidental. It was not the byproduct of isolation or indifference. It was deliberate. The Old Ones did not simply build structures and species. They built systems of interaction. They designed governance that did not rely on command, but on alignment. Theirs was a form of administration more advanced than any central government. Instead of forcing populations into ideological boxes, they allowed order to emerge from the foundational principles encoded into the life forms themselves. We can only speculate based on surviving ruins, behavioral artifacts, and traces in myth. But the signs point to a philosophy of distributed stewardship. The Old Ones didn't manage worlds from afar with fleets or governors. They created self-regulating networks, ecological, social, and psychic, that allowed planets to guide themselves. Each world was a node, each species a variable. But they all operated within parameters, guiding constraints, subtle and unspoken, like the banks of a river that shaped the current without needing to tell it where to go. Some of these parameters were genetic, instincts shaped to encourage cooperation, curiosity, and stability over aggression or dominance. Others were technological, planetary constructs that monitored atmospheric conditions, tectonic shifts, or resource distribution, and subtly adjusted environmental factors to keep society on course. And still others were metaphysical, psychic harmonics embedded into ecosystems that fostered emotional equilibrium. It was a governance that worked through balance, not power. There is no evidence the Old Ones built capitals. No central seat of authority has ever been found. Instead, what remains are hubs, knowledge nexuses, biological coordination centers, harmonization points that served more as cooperative way stations than centers of command. In these hubs, species may have interacted through shared memory fields, psychic networks, or symbolic languages that operated on multiple sensory levels. Perhaps decisions weren't made through argument, but through synchronization, multiple parties aligning their perceptions until the right course became self-evident. In the place of laws, the Old Ones created designs, systems where conflict became self-defeating, where destructive behavior led not to escalation, but to natural rebalancing. If a species deviated too far from its intended behavioral norms, environmental and biological feedback loops would quietly correct the imbalance. Some theorize the Old Ones used a form of emergent governance, not unlike biological homeostasis. Just as the body adjusts temperature, pH, and hydration without conscious effort, so too did Old One civilization self-regulate. A planetary population grew unstable. The atmospheric nutrient balance shifted subtly, prompting behavioral shifts. A species grew too aggressive. Their emotional state was moderated by background psychic fields or dormant epigenetic programs. It's worth noting, this was not control, not in the way tyrants understand it. The Old Ones did not override free will. They cultivated systems where destructive choices became unsustainable, while productive ones led to harmony. Freedom was never outlawed, but freedom came with embedded consequence. Their influence was also non-linear. Time for the Old Ones was not a constraint, it was a medium. They planted constructs designed to activate long after their departure, triggered only when a civilization reached a certain threshold of awareness. These constructs, now mostly inert or buried, once served as mentors, not masters, guiding civilizations toward sustainable self-governance. Records from early Eldar myth suggest such awakened structures taught without words, communicating through shared visions, dreams, and experiential memories. These weren't downloads of information. They were transferences of understanding, bypassing language entirely. This decentralized, responsibility-driven philosophy extended into interstellar interaction. Rather than forming rigid federations or military coalitions, the Old Ones facilitated collaborative alignments between species. These were not treaties, but shared purposes. Worlds separated by thousands of light years coordinated their development through the webway, exchanging knowledge and ecological techniques without competing for dominance. The Old Ones' approach to governance was not about holding power. It was about seeding wisdom. They knew that control is temporary. A society forced into peace through strength will always break. But a society that understands the value of peace through biology, through shared memory, through environmental harmony, sustains itself. There were, of course, failures. Not all species adapted, not all cultures matured. Some civilizations, despite their design, devolved into hierarchy, into tribalism, into unchecked competition, and in those cases the Old Ones did not always intervene. That too seems to have been part of their ideology. They accepted entropy. Not every world could succeed, not every experiment would hold, but the system, the larger pattern, was robust. A few failures would not collapse the whole. That is perhaps the most alien part of their thinking to modern minds. They did not need perfection. They needed sustainability, stability, continuity. Even today, the remains of this philosophy persist, not in monuments, but in behaviors. Some orc clans, even in their devolved, brutal form, still exhibit innate coordination and shared instinct for balance between fighting and regeneration. The Eldar, despite their descent into decadence, still retain ancient customs of shared psychic alignment in their rituals. Fragments of a forgotten social architecture. And there are stranger hints. Isolated pre-imperial human cultures with genetic memories of symbols never recorded. Ecosystems that appear artificially synchronized. Cryptic ruins that encode non-hierarchical decision-making systems into their architecture. These are echoes of the Old One's way, systems that govern without governors, balance without borders. It is difficult to grasp for species who've only ever known authority as control, who've only ever experienced order through enforcement. But for the Old Ones, true civilization was not a matter of obedience, it was a matter of integration. To be part of their domain was not to serve them, but to be part of something larger than any individual, any city, any species. To exist not in competition, but in coordination. Not by fear of consequence, but by understanding of one's place in a greater continuity. They did not forge an empire, they cultivated one. Not through conquest, not through edict, but through design, patience, and the quiet conviction that the galaxy could organize itself, if only given the chance. That was the governance of the Old Ones, not chains, connections. There are ruins in the galaxy so old they predate memory itself, structures so weathered by time and entropy that even their atoms seem reluctant to hold form. They sit on dead moons, half buried beneath tectonic drift or hidden in the radiation storms of gas giants, untouched for tens of millions of years. And yet, they endure, not through chance, not by accident, but by design. These are the remains of the Old Ones, not their cities, not their palaces, but the artifacts of their intellect. What they left behind was not legacy in the sense of pride, but function in the pursuit of stability. Their works were not meant to be admired. They were meant to work, and to keep working long after they were gone. To mistake these constructs for simple tools or temples is to misunderstand everything about them. The Old Ones did not build in the way younger species do. They did not erect buildings for comfort or status, nor for symbolism. Each structure, each machine, each installation served a direct purpose, though what that purpose is, in many cases, has long since been forgotten. In the deserts of Archeos 9, there exists a circular depression nearly 300 kilometers wide. At first mistaken for an impact crater, later surveys revealed concentric rings of metallic composite fused into bedrock. These rings are impervious to heat, pressure, and time itself. At the exact center, a towerless foundation emits a constant pulse, inaudible, invisible, but measurable. Every 42 seconds, precisely, no civilization in existence has been able to determine what it is broadcasting or why. It has continued uninterrupted for over 60 million years. This is typical of Old One constructs. They do not demand attention. They do not explain themselves. They simply function endlessly with purpose known only to their makers. The Eldar once theorized that such monuments were part of a vast network of galactic stabilization points, machines that subtly influence gravity, time flow, or even warp space in specific regions. Not to reshape reality, but to maintain equilibrium within it. The Old Ones were less interested in changing the galaxy than in ensuring it remained stable enough for life to flourish. Other structures defy even basic categorization. On the world of Lutherel, explorers discovered a series of archways embedded into a canyon wall. When walked through in sequence, always in prime number order, they cause localized fluctuations in mass, temperature, and perception. The archways cannot be moved, and when scanned, they produce no energy signatures. Yet they operate with flawless consistency. They were not defensive nor offensive. They were part of the natural machinery of the galaxy, inserted not to dominate but to support. Among the more enigmatic examples are the so-called resonance vaults. These subterranean chambers, often found on tectonically unstable planets, contain complex crystalline arrays capable of absorbing seismic activity and redistributing it safely across surrounding crust. Some even react to emotional states, triggered only when large groups experience fear or panic. The implication is chilling, that these machines were designed not only to stabilize the Earth, but to sense and respond to sentient thought. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that many Old One devices still operate in complete secrecy, hidden beneath oceans, buried within mountains, or cloaked in psychic fields. Unlike modern technology, which is often loud, demanding, and inefficient, Old One constructs are self-sufficient and silent. They do not announce their presence. They are not here to impress. They are here to function and to preserve what can be preserved. What distinguishes the Old Ones from all who came after is the lack of vanity in their technology. They left no statues of themselves, no murals of triumph, no plaques. Where modern empires erect spires to proclaim their greatness, the old ones embedded their understanding into the fabric of existence itself. Their monuments are mechanisms, their achievements invisible unless studied with unimaginable precision. And yet there was aesthetic. Not decoration, not vanity, but a kind of mathematical beauty in their construction. Every angle, every proportion, every harmonic frequency obeys a logic so pure, so elegant, that even the most advanced species, such as the Eldari or the Necrons, cannot fully grasp it. Their machines are not cluttered with moving parts or volatile cores. They are clean, smooth, and geometrically seamless. There are legends of devices that resonate in tune with certain species' brainwaves, or shift shape depending on the psychic signature of the user. These artifacts are rare and often considered myth, but enough reports exist across divergent civilizations to suggest some are real. They are not tools in the conventional sense. They are interfaces, designed not to be operated, but to respond, to align, and perhaps to teach. And then there are the non-physical constructs, less understood and more haunting. The old ones created systems that exist conceptually, not in metal or crystal, but in structure and pattern. Planetary orbit patterns that form harmonic sequences when mapped over long enough timescales. Language-like data encoded in the migration cycles of avian species. Psychic symbols found independently on planets thousands of light years apart, always buried beneath ancient neural ruins. These may not be physical devices, but informational artifacts, structures made of pattern, of behavior, of thought. Not written language, but designed recurrence. Whether these patterns were meant to trigger memories, maintain alignment, or warn against specific deviations is unknown. But they represent the old one's most advanced form of expression, one that transcended language, culture, and even time itself. No user manuals, no instructions, just existence, waiting to be understood. And yet, with all this utility, there remains an undertone of warning in some of their works. On certain worlds, ruins emit psychic interference fields, low ambient pulses that dull warp resonance or prevent demonic entities from forming. These areas, often thought to be protected zones, may have been quarantine barriers intended to contain spiritual pollution. Others, more alarming, house devices that remain inactive, but scan constantly, patiently, waiting for something to trigger them. It is possible that not all Old One machines were built to maintain. Some may have been built to watch, to detect change, to anticipate corruption. This does not suggest paranoia, but preparedness. The Old Ones, in all their wisdom, never assumed permanence. They prepared for collapse. Their machines reflect that awareness, tools not just to nurture, but to repair, to restart, and if necessary, to end. What the galaxy inherited was not a museum, but a living archive of intent and readiness, and we have barely scratched its surface. The Mechanicus has declared many Old One relics non-machine, heretical in form and logic. Eldari farsers speak of forgotten guardians whose spirits sleep in glass and stone. The Necrons, despite their hatred, seem to recognize some Old One devices as threats, interfering with their phase protocols or disintegrating their constructs when touched. Perhaps most chilling of all is that many of these artifacts still respond, not with violence, not with communication, but with silent recalibration. They do not speak to us, but they adjust, ever so slightly, as though trying to assess whether we are what was expected or something else entirely. We do not understand their purpose, but that was never the point. The Old Ones built for endurance, not clarity, for outcome, not explanation. Their monuments are not there to tell us who they were. They're there to keep working, long after memory has faded, long after names have been lost. Because to the Old Ones, meaning was not in pride. It was in function, and their works still endure, silent, watching, waiting. Among the dust-choked ruins of long-dead worlds and the hidden vaults beneath worlds that never knew conquest, there exist beings that do not die, they do not breathe, they do not sleep, and most have not moved in millions upon millions of years, and yet they watch, still, unblinking. These are the sentinels of the old ones, artificial constructs, guardians, watchers, and instruments of a civilization so advanced that it saw fit to create not only life, but companionship, defense, and labor in forms beyond flesh. Machines, yes, but never crude, never expendable. These were not tools to be used and discarded. They were partners in function, parts of a whole, and perhaps in some strange and distant way, trusted. When we speak of artificial constructs in the modern era, we think of servitors, data looms, mechanical drones, tools designed to replicate a single function or mimic a biological task without complaint. The old ones thought on a scale that made such simplicity irrelevant. Their constructs were multidimensional agents, built to observe, decide, adapt, and sometimes intervene. They were not made from simple alloys or programmable logic. The materials of their bodies were often biomechanical composites, self-repairing, self-calibrating, responsive to psychic fields and environmental stimuli. Some were rooted in place, integrated with planetary systems. Others were mobile, capable of operating across vast terrains or even between worlds. But what separated them most from the machines of lesser races was this: autonomy. Old One constructs were not commanded. They were instructed, and even that may be an oversimplification. Most appear to have been informed of a purpose, set upon a trajectory of action, and then left to carry it out across any span of time necessary, adapting as needed. This level of trust in artificial intelligence was not reckless. It was engineered. These constructs were built not only with data processing cores, but with behavioral frameworks based on principles of logic harmonized with environmental context. They didn't just know what to do. They understood why. On ancient sentinel worlds, places believed to have served as laboratories, archives, or biological sanctuaries, monolithic constructs have been discovered that still function in subtle ways. They do not move, but if disturbed, they respond. Not always with violence, but with atmospheric changes, electromagnetic disruptions, or psychic interference fields that discourage further intrusion. These are not defenses. They are discouragements, warnings. The constructs are fulfilling their role, not to destroy, but to protect. Some constructs are colossal, towering figures standing dormant amid the bones of fallen cities, their outer shells etched with glyphs no race has ever translated. Their hands are often outstretched, not in aggression, but as if offering. Whether these were teachers, stewards, or peacekeepers is unknown. But the imagery is clear. They were never built to instill fear. They were built to interact. Other, smaller constructs are far less obvious. Serpentine machines coiled beneath lake beds, crustacean-like drones embedded into rock faces, winged observers clinging to high-altitude clouds. These appear to be designed for observation and analysis, collecting data, possibly transmitting it through dormant webway threads that only they still access. And then there are the most mysterious constructs of all, those that appear not to be built, but grown. These biosynthetic organisms blur the line between machine and life form so thoroughly that even the most skilled xenobiologists cannot classify them. They possess organs that function as energy reactors, eyes that can see across dimensions, and appendages that shift form depending on environmental need. They bleed fluid that alters molecular structure on contact and emit low-frequency tones that calm nearby fauna. Some even react to the presence of sentient emotion, mirroring it, amplifying it, or muting it, as though they were designed to moderate psychological states. Who were these constructs made for? It seems unlikely they were created for the Old Ones themselves. No evidence exists of these beings serving their creators directly. Rather, they appear to have been stationed across the galaxy as intermediaries, ambassadors to fledgling species, silent caretakers of experimental worlds, or perhaps testers, gauging whether certain species had reached cognitive maturity. In this role, they were likely passive for most of their existence. Some species may have mistaken them for local deities, worshipped them, built shrines around them, copied their design motifs into clothing or architecture. The Old Ones never corrected such errors. For them, myth was sometimes a useful vector for learning. Constructs varied depending on purpose. On psychic-rich worlds, they were designed to resonate with the local warp field, smoothing ripples, insulating minds, or channeling collective thought into focused disciplines. On high-gravity planets, they were angular, magnetically anchored, able to compress and expand mass at will. On low-light or deep-space stations, they used photonic camouflage, becoming invisible not through stealth, but by matching the memory of the observer. They were not everywhere, but they were where they needed to be. And crucially, they still are. In the black reaches of the galactic halo, a Mechanicus expedition reported a humanoid figure carved of obsidian-colored material floating upright in the vacuum between systems. It moved slowly with no visible propulsion, ignoring hails and weapon locks alike. When approached, it altered the programming of every servo-skull on the expedition's ship simultaneously, without transmitting a single signal. Then it vanished. No engagement, no hostility, just a message. Another construct, this one unearthed beneath the crust of a dead planet, reactivated only when a large population of humans with compatible brainwave patterns settled in the region. It did not attack. It began recording. Hundreds of kilometers of subterranean machinery began lighting up softly, quietly, as if it had simply been waiting for the correct inputs to arrive. Perhaps the most chilling example comes from Eldar records of the Silent Shepherd, a construct reportedly encountered once every few centuries near dying stars. Described as bipedal, faceless, and cloaked in shifting light, it appears only during mass extinction events. It does not interfere, it merely watches. And when the destruction is complete, it departs into the void, into the webway, into time itself. What does it mean? The constructs of the Old Ones were never soldiers in the traditional sense. They were not designed to wage wars nor enforce authority. They were built to preserve systems, to teach, to observe, to respond. They are expressions of a worldview where protection does not always require force, and where understanding is the first line of defense against collapse. Their existence raises unsettling questions. What are they waiting for? What activates them? And most importantly, who do they still serve? Are they fulfilling long-expired instructions out of blind programming? Or do they operate on a set of principles so enduring, so deeply ingrained, that they no longer require orders at all? Perhaps the Old Ones knew they would not last forever. Perhaps they foresaw the coming darkness, the chaos, the wars that would fracture the galaxy. And in anticipation of that, they left behind watchers, not to intervene too early, but to endure and to guide if needed. Not all constructs remain neutral. Some have responded to threats with lethal precision, activating ancient defense protocols that vaporize orbital fleets in moments. Not out of malice, but because something crossed a threshold, a line that only they can perceive. There may be hundreds still dormant, slumbering beneath cities, oceans, or ice, waiting not for a command, but for the conditions they were designed to recognize. They do not care about titles or empires. They do not distinguish between species, ideology, or technology level. They see patterns, risk, disruption, and when the time comes, they act. Because that is their role, And long after the last race has faded, long after the last empire has turned to dust, they will remain, the custodians of an order older than war, older than memory, older than fear. To create life is a monumental feat. To create intelligence, true, self-determining intelligence, is something more. It is dangerous, it is delicate, it is irreversible. And the old ones did it not once, but many times, across thousands of worlds, for reasons that still defy simple understanding. Their most advanced bioengineering was not in the construction of ecosystems or the stabilization of planets. It was in the intentional design of sentient species, not as slaves, not as servants, but as participants in a vast, interwoven galactic purpose. Every intelligent life form they seeded, guided, or uplifted was shaped not simply to survive, but to contribute something unique to a greater whole. And this was not uniform. The old ones did not copy and paste success. They did not stamp out civilizations from a single mold. Instead, each intelligent species was tailored, engineered for diversity, difference, even contradiction. Because they understood a truth few others ever have, strength lies in variation. Let us begin with what is perhaps the most famous of their creations, though even that term is debated, the Eldar. Crafted in the latter ages of Old One activity, the Eldar were not simply a race designed to thrive in the material world. They were shaped to exist in two realms simultaneously, real space and the immaterium. Their souls burned brightly, their emotions deep and vibrant, and through this resonance they could manipulate the warp like few others. They were not only meant to build civilizations, they were meant to maintain psychic stability across vast regions of space. The Eldar were given long lifespans, immense mental capacity, and a natural elegance in their coordination with energy, matter, and thought. Their culture, even in its decadent form today, reflects the foundations laid by the old ones: symmetry, mindfulness, collective motion, and psychic attunement. They were never meant to rule others. They were built to resonate, to act as psychic tuning forks across the galaxy, harmonizing life with the immaterium before it grew unstable. But the Eldar were not the only such experiment. Where the Eldar were built for perception and refinement, the Krork, now degraded into the Orc species, were engineered for endurance and aggression, but not mindless violence. The original Krork were highly structured, controlled, and directed. They were created as a stabilizing martial force, living weapons that could be deployed to protect seeded worlds and suppress threats, not merely as brutes, but as a kind of living immune system for the galaxy. The Krork were built with genetic memory, ensuring that crucial skills, battle knowledge, and even technological comprehension were passed down biologically. Their crude behavior today masks the brilliance of their original design, a species that could coordinate through instinct alone, adapt to any environment, and operate independently for millennia without oversight. It was redundancy in its most aggressive form. Then came the Jokaero, a species many still misunderstand. Small, simian, silent, and seemingly chaotic, the Jokaero were never designed for command or combat. They were builders, engineers whose intelligence is not learned but encoded. Their ability to instinctively manipulate technology, even devices they have never seen before, is not sorcery. It is deep design, a genetic blueprint that recognizes logic, adapts systems, and modifies energy flow without conscious analysis. They were seeded across many regions, often in orbitals or as planetary maintainers. Wherever Old One structures required persistent adjustment but not psychic interference, the Jokaero ensured function without oversight. And yet, these three, Eldar, Krork, and Jokaero, are only the most prominent examples. Archaeoxeno records speak of others. There were the Q-Sal Ancients, rumored to have been a species designed for predictive modeling, capable of forecasting galactic events, not through prophecy, but through psychic pattern recognition and high-dimensional cognition. Their minds operated like simulations, allowing them to foresee the likely outcomes of ecological or socio-political shifts centuries in advance. Another group, long since lost to time, were known only as the Lacrimidae, a species designed not for interaction, but for observation. Ethereal, non-corporeal by the end of their known history, they appear in the records of multiple species as the Watchers beneath the soil, linked to subterranean Old One facilities. Some believe they were designed to record and transmit cultural development across entire continents, acting as passive sentience monitoring systems embedded within planetary crust. Other experiments were less successful. There are records of species that collapsed, that turned on their purpose or mutated beyond containment. Some may have destroyed themselves in cycles of madness or spiritual excess. Others were abandoned when the Old Ones withdrew from their work. But perhaps what's most astonishing is how many of these species were left to evolve independently. The Old Ones did not micromanage. Once a species had stabilized its psychic and biological framework, aligned with its ecosystem, the Old Ones often stepped away, sometimes entirely. The species was left with only traces of their influence, an obelisk here, a residual psychic field there, and allowed to determine its own course. This was not neglect, it was test. The Old Ones needed species that could survive, adapt, and collaborate without them. It wasn't about creating pets or puppets. It was about creating peers, partners in the preservation of galactic order, contributors to the vast distributed system they had built. One of the most controversial theories in modern xenology is that humans may have been one such long-range experiment. Our psychic sensitivity, our physical adaptability, and our tendency toward pattern-driven social systems bear uncanny resemblance to other Old One projects, if degraded or incomplete. The fact that humanity's rise was delayed until after the Old One's disappearance may not be coincidence, but part of a slow bloom design, meant to activate in a later epoch when other forces had faded. If true, it would mean that the galaxy itself still contains latent instructions, species growing toward a purpose they were never told, seeded long ago, waiting for an event they were never warned of. Not every species was made equal, but each had a role, a specialization, some for defense, some for healing, some for memory, others for coordination. There is reason to believe that a few were even created to die, to act as buffers in psychic fields, absorbing entropy, suffering, or chaos so others might persist. The Old Ones didn't just create life to see it flourish. They created a network of sentient interdependence, each species designed not for dominion, but for contribution. Their aim was not peace, not in the simplistic way we often define it. Their goal was resilience. A civilization of civilizations, independent, diverse, but aligned. They understood that true galactic order couldn't come from a central throne. It had to emerge from collaborative evolution, multiple intelligent species, coexisting in tension and cooperation, balancing one another not by design alone, but by necessity. That is why they made so many, and why they never returned to rule them. Because the test was never whether the species could obey. The test was whether they could stand without them. And now, in the wake of their disappearance, in a galaxy fracturing under war and ruin, the echoes of those ancient intelligences remain. Scattered, mutated, lost, but not gone. They are still among us. They always were. For all their power, for all their planning, the Old Ones were not omniscient. They were careful, extraordinarily so. They mapped stars before they formed, seeded planets with layer upon layer of purpose, and constructed civilizations designed to last longer than memory itself. But despite all of it, there were things they could not prevent. Because not everything in the galaxy can be controlled, some things cannot be predicted, and others should never have been allowed to exist. This was the unseen war, a struggle not fought in grand battles or galactic invasions, but in silence, in secrecy, in the shadows of space and the folds of reality itself. A war fought not with armies, but with containment protocols, environmental manipulation, and systemic isolation. A war the galaxy barely remembers because the old ones made sure no one ever knew. There are remnants, scars, abandoned planetary systems sealed off by orbital machines that still sterilize anything that enters. Moons missing from gravitational records, marked with psychic anomalies that distort probability and thought. Deep space voids where warp travel becomes erratic, where ships vanish without trace and thoughts echo back wrong. These are not accidents, they are containment zones. During their long stewardship of the galaxy, the Old Ones encountered forces that were not natural, not part of the cycle of life or the evolution of sentience, things that did not belong. It is unclear whether these anomalies were the result of early cosmic instability, parallel realities bleeding through, or consequences of the Old Ones' own failed experiments. What is clear is that they recognized these threats and moved to contain them. They did not destroy these anomalies. They rarely could. Instead, they did something far more effective. They removed them from interaction. Entire planetary systems were converted into inert quarantine fields, not through brute force, but through environmental deadening. The atmosphere was nullified. The orbit adjusted subtly until solar radiation erased any chance of organic reemergence. Life was scrubbed not with fire, but with calibration. Where that wasn't possible, the Old Ones constructed dimensional anchor fields, zones of warped space-time locked in stasis. These regions appear frozen to external sensors, but subtle gravitational fluctuations suggest something continues inside. These anchors are powered by mechanisms no species has successfully replicated. Even the Necrons, who inherited fragments of this ancient knowledge, never fully understood how the Old Ones did it. And then, there are the Black Vaults. Across the galaxy, hidden in impossible places, beneath gas giants, within asteroid clusters, inside dormant warp storms, there are massive structures sealed in inertium alloy and metaphysical locks. They cannot be opened by technology. They cannot be bypassed by the warp. Their entrances respond only to configurations long lost to history. Inside them, no one knows. But the implication is unmistakable. The Old Ones did not always succeed in preventing catastrophe. Sometimes they simply locked it away. There are fragments of Eldar lore that speak of these places, not in words, but in symbols. The most ancient seer paths refer to them only as the quiet edges, or the places that must not awaken. The craft worlds give them wide berth. Even Slanesh has shown no interest in them, as if the danger inside is not just physical, not even psychic, but ontological, a threat to reality itself. Perhaps these anomalies were not threats the Old Ones created, but found. Or perhaps they were byproducts of experiments gone wrong, tests of time manipulation, dimensional folding, or psychic amplification that fractured the balance they worked so hard to maintain. If so, they learned their lesson quickly and responded with chilling precision. The greatest weapon the Old Ones ever wielded in this secret war was obscurity. They erased knowledge, not just from their own archives, but from the minds of the species they had uplifted. There are entire bloodlines among the Eldar that carry genetic scars from psychic memory removal, fragments of understanding surgically sliced away across generations. Some orc clans display inexplicable taboos against specific planetary alignments or colors, embedded in their cultural instincts with no context. These are not random. These are safety measures. The Old Ones did not trust even their most loyal creations with knowledge of these anomalies, not because they feared rebellion, but because they feared curiosity. In a galaxy where thought influences the warp, sometimes knowing a thing is enough to give it shape again. So they made their war invisible. Entire species may have been wiped out, not for hostility, but because they came too close to understanding. Civilizations quietly dissolved, displaced, or genetically altered to eliminate awareness. Systems removed from star charts, coordinates altered, psychic beacons shut down. What little we know comes from accidents, fractured ruins that slipped through the sensors, machines too well hidden to be dismantled, or the oldest of races remembering just enough to be terrified. The Necron, before their transformation, encountered these boundaries, and even with all their bitterness toward the Old Ones, they refused to trespass. After becoming Necrons, they tried. Once, in the Segmentum Obscurus, there is a field of dead Necron tomb ships surrounding a planet whose surface appears normal, but whose atmosphere deletes data, records, memory. The ships never reached the ground. They simply stopped. The Old Ones didn't win the unseen war through violence. They won it through precision. But at what cost? Because some of the containment zones are failing. Not many. Not yet. But as time wears on, entropy frays even the best prepared defenses. The psychic seals weaken. The gravitational locks drift. And worse, young species stumble where they were never meant to walk. Imperial explorators have already cracked open 2 containment sites by accident, both resulting in planetary quarantine, one in full exterminatus. In neither case could the Adeptus Mechanicus explain what they found, only that the constructs inside didn't register as matter, and their influence altered perception across planetary distances. This isn't a new war, it's the same war still playing out. The Old Ones may be gone, but their battle never ended. They laid traps, barriers, instructions, but few now understand them. And the things they locked away, the realities they rejected, are still there, waiting. Because the true tragedy of the unseen war isn't that it happened, it's that it never stopped. Even now, the constructs and warning systems left behind continue their vigil. Some watch from orbit. Some sleep beneath the crusts of seemingly quiet worlds. Others lie dormant inside warp space, invisible but ever-present. And in some deep places, the systems are waking up. Not because of a threat, but because the conditions have changed. The races of the galaxy, unaware of what they stir, expand into ancient boundaries. They dig where they shouldn't. They think in ways that breach old safeguards. And when the old defenses fail, when the final seals crack, there will be no warning, no last stand, just exposure, and the return of that which should never have been. So now we ask, did the Old Ones build enough safeguards? And more urgently, did they leave anyone behind to finish what they started? Because the anomalies are real, the locks are weakening, and the war, the one no one sees, is about to begin again. Long before warp drives carved rough scars across space and time, before starships dared the storm of the Immaterium, and long before the Imperium built its fragile network of void routes and navigational aids, there existed a system so precise, so vast, and so far beyond modern understanding that even now the galaxy cannot replicate it. It is called the Webway, not a warp route, not a tunnel, not a highway in space. The Webway is a dimension of structure layered beneath real space, a network of corridors, vaults, chambers, and transit arteries woven through a folded reality, more stable than the warp, and yet adjacent to it. It is not natural, it was built, sculpted, forged not out of stone or metal, but out of fundamental forces, gravity, psychic resonance, and quantum fields knotted into form. and it was the Old Ones who made it. To speak of the webway is to speak of one of their most profound achievements, not because it was their most powerful creation, but because it was their most intentional. Unlike their ecosystems, which often evolved with minimal interference, or their constructs, which were designed for localized control, the webway was a galactic-scale intervention. It was their infrastructure, their operating system, their backbone. Not just a way to travel, but a way to connect, to monitor, to redirect, to preserve. The webway spanned the entire galaxy and beyond. It reached into every corner where life had been seeded or was meant to emerge. Wherever an Old One construct stood, a thread of the webway pulsed silently beneath the surface. Some corridors were broad enough for fleets to traverse. Others were so narrow that they carried only thought, sub-psychic data transmissions moving faster than light, bypassing causality itself. This network allowed the Old Ones to manage their empire not with force, but with presence. They didn't need relay stations. They didn't need to build roads or comms towers. The webway gave them immediacy, instantaneous access, response, and influence across any distance. From a central node, or perhaps multiple distributed ones, they could observe ecological shifts, psychic fluctuations, and the health of entire species in real time. But the webway was more than a transport system. It was also a firewall. Because as the Old Ones expanded their mastery of the warp, they discovered its dangers. They realized early on that the immaterium, though useful as a medium for energy and thought, was fundamentally unstable, shaped by emotion, corrupted by excess, and vulnerable to distortion. To travel through it directly was to risk alteration, so they built the webway to bypass the warp entirely, not to tame it, but to avoid it. Within the webway, the influence of the warp is buffered, reduced to the point where even powerful psychic entities cannot breach its walls without great effort. For millennia, the Old Ones used this corridor space not only for movement, but for refuge. Entire biological archives were stored within pocket dimensions deep inside the webway, shielded from warp currents and temporal collapse. It is likely that, even now, some of their knowledge survives in those sealed nodes, inaccessible to any race that does not know the right frequency, the right resonance, the right psychic key. Access to the webway was always deliberate. You couldn't stumble into it. Entry points were guarded, some physically, some psychically, others sealed behind ecosystems that functioned like lock-and-key mechanisms. On certain worlds, entire species were designed with genetic markers that could unlock local webway nodes, allowing access only under specific evolutionary conditions. There are reports, fragmentary, often dismissed, of planets where temples align with starlight only once every 100,000 years, triggering openings in reality. Of biological ruins that awaken when a species achieves its first psychic awakening. These weren't accidents. They were scheduled entries into the webway, pre-configured eons in advance. This level of foresight is staggering, and it confirms something critical. The Old Ones didn't use the webway merely to manage. They used it to time, to coordinate not just space, but history. A civilization born on one world might take 1,000,000 years to develop, another only 10,000. Through the webway, the Old Ones could monitor both, adjusting conditions subtly, ensuring that when the two species met, it happened at the right moment, under controlled circumstances. The webway was not just logistics, it was curation. Even the Eldar, who inherited fragments of this system, barely understand its full extent. Their craft worlds navigate what little remains of its stable corridors, but vast regions have been lost, collapsed, sealed, or overrun by forces not meant to ever find their way inside. The Eldar still speak in reverent tones of the hidden vaults, places within the webway that no farseer has dared breach in millennia. What sleeps inside? Records, machines, beings, or warnings? Because, as with all Old One constructs, the webway was built with defenses. When the war in heaven raged and the Necron-turned Necrons began their genocidal purge of all life, the webway became more than a transportation system. It became a refuge. The Old Ones began to pull entire ecosystems into its fold. Biodomes, cultural cores, knowledge clusters, entire biomes relocated into pocket zones, untouched by the external chaos. Some believe that this evacuation was part of a final plan, not to fight back, but to preserve enough genetic and cultural material to restart civilization once the Necrons' madness burned itself out. It may even be true. There are legends, even among the Eldari, of sealed webway gates that hum with activity, still powered, still alive. It's possible entire species still slumber within, waiting for the right conditions to emerge, waiting for a signal that may never come. But the webway, as mighty as it was not invulnerable. Its vastness was also its vulnerability. When the Necrons turned their gaze to the psychic, when the warp began to boil with nascent emotion, and the first hints of chaos flickered into being, cracks formed. Psychic feedback, emotional resonance, and outright sabotage tore holes in the structure. Some corridors collapsed, others became tainted, invaded by things that should never have found their way in. And now, in the modern age, those cracks have widened. Webway breaches have become more common. Demons stalk corridors once thought pure. Ancient defenses fail. And worse, mortals, Imperials, Drukhari, Chaos worshippers use the webway for their own ends, not understanding what they walk upon. Each intrusion wears the system thinner. But still, it holds. Not because it is strong, but because it was made right. It was made with care, not ambition, with harmony, not hunger. It was built not to dominate the galaxy, but to serve it. And even now, with its creators long vanished, the webway continues its work, subtle, silent. There are tunnels still sealed, locks not yet broken, nodes that pulse with soft light, awaiting the right key, the right moment, the right mind. Because the Old Ones didn't build the webway for themselves alone. They built it for what came next, for those who could be trusted, for those who could walk the hidden paths without breaking them. So the webway endures, not just as a passage, but as a promise. There are worlds that look like paradise, planets thick with green, overflowing with water, air so clean it seems unnatural, because it is. From orbit they appear untouched by industry, by war, or by time itself. But land on them, dig deep enough, and one will find that beneath the flora and the still lakes lies a silence far older than any natural peace. A watching silence. These are the bio-vault worlds, also called contingency worlds, by those few who've studied them without being silenced or driven mad. And they are among the Old Ones' most secret and haunting legacies. They are not monuments. They are not laboratories. They are not colonies. They are plans. Not plans in the way modern species understand them. Not checklists or battle orders or coded messages waiting to be read. These are worlds designed to activate, to grow, to respond if certain conditions are met. They are alive, but not in the obvious ways. They are not just repositories of DNA or zoos of extinct creatures. They are repositories of continuity. Because the Old Ones knew something most empires never realize until too late, even the most perfect system can break. No matter how refined, how resilient, how thoughtful their designs were, the Old Ones knew that chaos was a constant. Wars would come. Species would falter. Entropy could not be defeated. It could only be prepared for. So they planted seeds. Not just across planets, but within them. Entire worlds built as fallback mechanisms, living vaults containing genetic material, environmental blueprints, biological knowledge, and most eerily, potential civilizations. Not just the biology of a people, but the conditions for their culture, their language, their development. Stored, preserved, encoded into life itself. Most of these planets remain dormant, undisturbed for tens of millions of years. And that's no accident, because each biovault is locked, not with doors or mechanical systems, but with biological prerequisites. These are planets designed to open themselves only under specific conditions. A certain atmospheric balance, the emergence of a particular neural signature, the triggering of psionic wavelengths that match ancient keys. Until then, they sleep. And they are very, very good at sleeping. Some have been mistaken for death worlds, or else ignored entirely. Some are buried beneath jungles so dense that orbital scans cannot penetrate. Others lie beneath crusts of planetary stone that have no apparent reason to exist. And in a few rare cases, entire worlds have been misidentified as asteroids, so thoroughly masked by debris or cloaking fields that they no longer appear in stellar charts. But now and then, one wakes up, and when it does, it doesn't announce itself. It simply begins. Temperature shifts, flora changes, local species evolve rapidly in a single generation, atmospheric content begins to adjust, and somewhere, always far from prying eyes, a vault opens. Sometimes a grove, sometimes a pool, sometimes a construct made of unknown material that unfolds into itself like origami in reverse. Inside, not treasure, not weapons, instructions, or perhaps invitation is the better word. Some vaults contain DNA sequences that can adapt to host species, reshaping them, enhancing cognitive capacity, psychic potential, or even instinctual memory. Others emit harmonic pulses that seem to alter thought patterns in higher life forms, bringing clarity, cohesion, even sudden flashes of insight that feel like ancestral memory. In at least 2 confirmed cases, entire primitive civilizations were transformed within a few hundred years of exposure. A species of semi-sapient arboreal predators on a world known to the Imperium as Oryx 7 suddenly began building structures with geometry far beyond their apparent intelligence. Within a single generation, their language doubled in complexity. They began forming concepts of time, space, and structure that mirrored those found in fragments of Old One code. They were not taught, they were unlocked. And this is what makes the biovaults so disturbing. They don't just preserve life, they shape it. Not forcibly, not overtly, but through environment, through biology, through suggestion. They are slow, patient teachers. They don't command, they encourage. The old ones didn't believe in imposing civilization. They believed in cultivating it. And these worlds do just that. But not all biovaults are safe. Some contain more than instructions. Some were never completed. Others were corrupted, perhaps by warp exposure, perhaps by intrusions, perhaps simply by time itself. The result is unpredictable. Some vaults open not with knowledge, but with malformed life, beings partially grown, programmed for environments that no longer exist. Others emit psychic echoes of pain, grief, or fear, emotional residue from long-dead civilizations encoded into environmental memory. There are even vaults that seem to exist as puzzles, deliberately difficult to access, designed only for a very specific kind of mind to unlock. These vaults may contain the most valuable information of all: pure insight, philosophical frameworks, metaphysical equations, fragments of the old one's decision-making logic. They are not weapons, but lenses, tools designed to help those who find them see the galaxy as the old ones saw it. The Eldar speak of such a place, hidden in a forgotten quadrant of webway space, where a vault sings instead of opens. A soft, repeating harmonic tone that echoes through the bones, not the ears. Supposedly only when multiple species sing in return, each providing a different part of a sonic key, will the vault unfold, If true, it would imply something even deeper, that the Old Ones didn't just plan for individuals to access their legacies. They planned for cooperation, that no one species would be enough. That unity, diverse, informed, and conscious, would be the key to their deepest gifts. And that makes sense, because these vaults were never about power. They were about preservation of potential. Everything the Old Ones built pointed toward a singular idea, the continuation of life in a form that could learn, adapt, and sustain. The vaults weren't backup drives for a failed system. They were second chances, controlled, hidden, and contingent, but waiting nonetheless. It's likely we've only found a fraction of them, and most of those have been ignored, misunderstood, or corrupted by careless hands. Some Imperials have attempted to seize them, only to find that their mechanics fail in the presence of psychic suppression. Others have tried to mine them, only to discover that the vaults themselves emit chemicals that slowly deaden technological systems or induce sleep in workers. They are not aggressive, but they refuse exploitation. That may be their most important feature. These vaults were not meant to be plundered, they were meant to be earned. Only those who approach with the right frequency, mental, psychic, emotional, can access them fully. And even then, the information must be interpreted, experienced, not merely read. Because knowledge alone isn't the goal. Understanding is. And so they wait, beneath oceans, beneath canopies, beneath silence, still functioning, still adjusting, still preparing. In the endless dark, the galaxy crumbles, empires rise and fall, species burn themselves out, and war consumes the stars. But beneath it all, in patient quietude, the seeds remain, watching, preparing, ready to offer if the galaxy ever becomes worthy again. They ruled nothing. They owned no thrones, held no banners, carved no emblems of their name into the galaxy's crust. And then, they were gone. No cataclysm, no final battle engraved into myth, no tombs or memorials. Just a silence, a slow, methodical fading from the fabric of known reality. One day there were structures being maintained, species being nurtured, worlds being overseen by unseen hands. And then, nothing. The disappearance of the Old Ones remains the greatest enigma in all of galactic history, not just because it happened, but because it happened so quietly. A civilization that once operated on a galactic scale, whose intellect spanned eons and whose creations persist even now, simply withdrew, vanished without war drums or proclamations. How? Why? And perhaps most importantly, was it even a disappearance at all? To begin unraveling this mystery, we must abandon modern assumptions. The disappearance of the Old Ones cannot be viewed through the lens of human history, or even that of other ancient races like the Necrons or the Eldar. The Old Ones did not measure their existence in lifespans or generations. Their thinking was systemic, distributed, non-linear. If they did fall, it was not in a single moment. It was a process, an exhalation of their presence from the galaxy. There are signs of their decline, subtle and layered. The earliest come not from archaeology, but from absence, sudden breaks in planetary data patterns. Species that once showed signs of guided development stalling mid-evolution. Climatic regulation mechanisms ceasing operation at precise intervals. Ecosystems losing their guiding nudges and entering chaotic drift. There were no floods of war, no sudden collapse. What happened was a withdrawal of maintenance. It was as if the caretakers simply stopped tending the garden. At first, this may have been intentional. Some believe the Old Ones began a strategic retreat during the late stages of their presence, slowly deactivating systems, withdrawing constructs, sealing webway corridors. Perhaps they saw the onset of the Necron rebellion, or sensed the psychic storm beginning to gather in the warp, the first writhings of what would become chaos. Whatever the reason, they may have chosen not to engage fully, not to fight, but to recede. Why would such an advanced species abandon their influence? Because they may have realized they could no longer control the outcome. The Necron tier, in their hunger for immortality and vengeance, had aligned themselves with powers beyond reason, the Citan. These starborn entities, predating even the old ones in raw existence, introduced new variables into the galactic equation, forces the old ones had perhaps never accounted for. The laws of physics bent beneath them. Entire biospheres were consumed. Worse still was the corruption of the warp. The old ones had always used the warp carefully, delicately, like dipping a hand into an ocean only when the waters were calm. But emotion was now filling that dimension. Passion, fear, rage, pain. Civilizations were growing too quickly. Psychic resonance was swelling, and with it, the shadows of something darker. It's possible, probable, that the old ones saw the first signs of what would become the Chaos Gods, not yet born, but bubbling beneath the surface. Consciousness coalescing in the immaterial, drawn from the very species the old ones had uplifted. The irony would not have escaped them. Their creations, meant to stabilize the galaxy, were beginning to destabilize it through sheer weight of thought. What do you do, then, if you are an ancient race watching your own designs edge toward catastrophe? Do you intervene? The old ones did not, and perhaps this was their final act of wisdom, or failure. They chose not to cleanse, not to sterilize, not to dominate, because domination was never part of their ethos. Instead, they began to pull away. They closed webway gates, they sealed biovaults, they shut down containment systems, not recklessly but strategically, ensuring the most dangerous forces were locked behind fail-safes. They silenced their constructs. They let go. Was it surrender? The old ones were not defeated in battle. The Necrons' war against them, however brutal, did not annihilate them. Their creations still function. Their knowledge still pulses in hidden places. The war, if anything, may have accelerated a decision already forming. A decision to disengage from a galaxy that was no longer ready for what they had built. Some scholars within the Eldar communities believe the old ones may not have died out at all, that they simply shifted form, retreated into deeper folds of the webway, or into realms inaccessible to physical beings. The deep webway holds secrets even the most powerful Farseers refuse to look into, and it is known that entire regions of folded reality remain sealed, their gates waiting for signals that have never come. Others claim the old ones sublimated, abandoned their physical forms entirely, their consciousnesses diffused into the warp in ways that avoided the attention of emergent chaos. Not as gods, but as silent harmonics, vibrations of wisdom buried so deep in the fabric of psychic space that they only influence the most subtle instincts in sentient life. And then there is the possibility, grim but plausible, that the old ones sacrificed themselves, not in fire but in function, that the webway was not just a transport system but a lifeboat, that their most ancient minds were poured into biovaults, constructs, and resonant data crystals, dismantled and embedded into the galaxy itself, preserved in pieces so they could someday reform. Not as a species, but as a principle, a legacy so interwoven into reality that it might someday be reborn not in flesh, but in thought. If true, it would mean that the old ones never intended to last forever, that they never sought permanence, only continuity. And now, millions of years later, the effects of their disappearance are still felt. The Eldar, once their most refined creation, stand on the edge of extinction. The Krork, designed for war and order, devolved into the Orcs, war incarnate without context. The Necrons awaken, bitter and stagnant, locked in soulless eternity. Humanity, perhaps a fragment of a forgotten plan, stumbles into powers it barely comprehends. The galaxy is sick, diseased with war, entropy, and despair. And yet, not all is lost, because even in their silence, the Old Ones left markers. They planned for collapse, they expected failure, and they built paths forward, sealed not with force, but with understanding. Vaults that only open when minds align, constructs that only function when harmony is achieved, knowledge that waits, not for conquerors, but for students. So perhaps their disappearance was not abandonment at all. Perhaps it was a final message. You are not ready. But someday you might be. And until then, the galaxy must endure. Through chaos, through ruin, through silence. Because the Old Ones are gone. But they are not forgotten. And in the hidden places, the sleeping systems, the faintest echoes of structured thought, they may yet return. There are no dictionaries of the Old Ones' language, no inscriptions etched into tablet or steel that clearly declare their origin, no monoliths bearing words of conquest, doctrine, or law. No translator has ever found a Rosetta Stone that speaks plainly in the tongue of those who came before. And yet their voice remains, not in the way we would expect, not as sound or text or symbology in the conventional sense, but in a more elusive, more alien, more permanent way, in resonance, in structures of thought, in repeating patterns of memory, in echoes. Across time and space, the Old Ones embedded their language not into things, but into processes. They spoke not to the ears, but to the mind behind the mind. To create something that would not erode or be misinterpreted, they did not write. They wove. What they created is often referred to by xeno-archaeolinguists as the echo code. It is not a language in the traditional sense. It is not spoken or written. It is felt, experienced, and in some cases, remembered by those who have never heard it before. Let us begin with what little is concrete. Certain Old One structures emit low-frequency vibrations, subsonic pulses that repeat at precise intervals. These pulses do not carry audio messages, but when translated into mathematical form, they reveal fractal patterns, self-repeating sequences embedded with increasing complexity. To most species, these patterns are meaningless, but to a few, those with psychic sensitivity or unusually plastic neural architecture, these pulses begin to generate impressions, not words, concepts, a feeling of harmony, a sense of pressure, a geometric visualization that appears in the mind's eye, always different depending on the individual, but always intentional. This is one layer of the echo code, a conceptual communication system that bypasses language entirely, interacting directly with the cognition of its recipient. It doesn't tell you what to think. It shapes the conditions by which your mind arrives at understanding. Why would the Old Ones build such a system? Because across the stars they were raising civilizations, not clones of themselves, but diverse life forms with different perceptions. Language is a product of biology, culture, and context. What a human calls light, an Eldar might perceive as emotional vibration. What an orc calls loud gubbins might actually be a fusion reaction. The Old Ones created a communication framework that could speak to all of them, not by using shared words, but by using shared cognitive phenomena. Imagine a message that can be understood by any mind capable of pattern recognition, emotion, and association, but interpreted uniquely by each according to their neural architecture. That is the echo code. Some say it is stored in dreams, that certain locations, ruins, vaults, even entire regions of space emit psychic tones that trigger subconscious visions. These dreams are never literal. They are not memory playback, but across multiple species and cultures, individuals have reported identical symbolic structures, an infinite staircase spiraling in both directions, a single eye in a sky with no stars, a triangle whose sides shift depending on the angle of observation. None of these mean anything in human language, but those who experience them often wake with a sense of completion, as if they've understood something just beyond articulation. The Echo Code may also be preserved in architecture, not decorative carvings or hieroglyphs, but in the very structure of space. Certain Old One constructs exhibit harmonized proportions when mapped in 3 or more dimensions, ratios not just aesthetically pleasing, but emotionally resonant. When these ratios are replicated in artificial environments, even rudimentary psychic species experience enhanced memory, reduced aggression, and increased cooperative behavior. It's as if these environments are speaking a behavioral dialect, guiding thought not with instruction, but with form. And then there's the most controversial theory, that sentient behavior itself was one of their languages, that the Old Ones seeded patterns of interaction, archetypal relationships, recurring social forms, instinctive narratives, into their creations. Not to control them, but to ensure that certain principles of understanding would emerge again and again, across eons, even after the Old Ones themselves were gone. This may explain why certain moral or philosophical frameworks, respect for life, balance over dominance, harmony between individuality and unity, recur across entirely disconnected species. Not because they're universal truths, but because they were planted ideas embedded into cognitive evolution by a long-departed architect. The Eldar still maintain oral rights, chants passed from generation to generation, that include phrases no longer understood, even by their most ancient farsers. Yet when these rites are performed near certain ruins, dormant Old One mechanisms activate. The implication is chilling, that the chants are not sound keys, but resonant memory cues, rituals designed to tune the mind to the right frequency. Some orc weird boys, during rare and unstable trances, have been known to sketch complex symbols in the dirt, geometric forms far beyond their usual mental scope. These symbols often mirror energy field harmonics found in Old One installations. The orcs do not know why they do this. They forget after. But the act itself is almost certainly an echo, a leftover subroutine in a degraded biological program. And humanity, even in the fragmented, bloody rise of mankind, hints remain. Xenolinguists within the Adeptus Mechanicus have quietly noted linguistic phenomena, repeating syllables and phonetic inversions that match structural cadence found in echo code pulse patterns. They are embedded in root languages, predating known imperial dialects by tens of thousands of years. Impossible, and yet persistent. Could it be that some remnants of the Echo Code were passed along not through artifact or structure, but through migration and speech, hitching a ride in myths, lullabies, and instinctual rhythms? If so, the Old Ones did more than build civilizations. They wrote across minds. But why? Why create a language no one remembers learning, no one teaches? And yet that appears again and again, always incomplete, always suggestive. Because the Echo Code was not about now, it was about then, and about someday. The Old Ones were seeding the possibility that, even in their absence, someone would eventually understand. Not their words, their purpose. And to do that, they had to leave something that could not be destroyed, mistranslated or corrupted by time, war, or ideology. They left a language of structure, sensation, and recursion, a language not stored in books but in neural pathways, in psychic harmonics, in the shape of thought itself. Even now the galaxy may be humming with this voice, and we simply lack the sensitivity to hear it. Perhaps one day a mind, human, alien, or something yet to be, will awaken in the right conditions at the right moment, and everything will click. The Echo Code will bloom, and the last message of the Old Ones will be received. A message not of warning, not of power, but of continuity, of remembering how to remember. Until then it waits, in symbols that shift, in dreams that linger, in ruins that feel like homes you've never known. The Old Ones are silent, but they have not stopped speaking. The galaxy is filled with loud civilizations, empires that shout their dominance in the void with weapons, monuments, banners, and blood. Races that carve their truths into stone and steel, declaring their beliefs in volume and violence. But beneath the chaos, beneath the grinding wars and declarations of supremacy, there is a silence that lingers. Not empty silence, purposeful silence. It is the kind of silence that only comes from a people who did not need to justify their existence, because their actions were already their language, their systems already their message. And it is from this silence that we begin to understand something that no war record or ruin ever says outright. The Old Ones had a philosophy, not one of words or commandments, not something that could be written in a tome or enforced with doctrine, but a philosophy of design, of purpose, of responsibility, etched not in words but in the structures of life they left behind. For the Old Ones, morality was not a code to be enforced. It was a pattern to be cultivated. To trace it is difficult. It lies scattered, hidden in the choices they made, not in what they destroyed, but in what they allowed to live. Not in what they controlled, but in what they stepped away from. Their guiding principle appears to have been preservation through autonomy. They did not impose order with conquest. They did not erase imperfection. They did not seek dominance over lesser species. Instead, they designed ecosystems and civilizations in balanced tension, allowing for conflict, creativity, failure, and even death, but always within a framework that could recover. This was the core of their moral architecture, not utopia, not perfection, but resilience. Where humans might demand loyalty and the Necrons pursue dominion, the Old Ones planted diversity. They believed in variation, not as a threat, but as a necessity for survival. Each species they uplifted was unique, not optimized for one task, but built to adapt and to reflect different aspects of consciousness. One could argue this was not just biology, it was ethics expressed in genetics. In a galaxy plagued by absolutes, purity, order, conquest, the Old Ones offered an opposing vision, cooperative complexity, a belief that no single species, no single solution, could account for all variables. So instead of enforcing a static ideal, they engineered dynamic systems, civilizations that could evolve based on emergent needs, and they trusted those systems enough to let them go. This is where their philosophy becomes most alien and most profound. The Old Ones knew that to truly preserve a thing, you could not possess it forever. You had to let it face uncertainty. That is why they never built empires. That is why their constructs are not found in positions of control, but in the margins, observing, encouraging, occasionally intervening when collapse was imminent, but always pulling back again. They created guardians, not governors. They taught through structure, not command. Some xenophilosophers have argued that the Old Ones operated on a post-moral logic, that their morality transcended binary categories of good and evil. This is a misunderstanding. The Old Ones may not have expressed their ethics in terms modern minds would recognize, but their designs demonstrate a clear value system. Life should be diverse. Consciousness should be capable of reflection. Power should be guided, not seized. And knowledge, above all, should be shared in layers, revealed only when understanding is sufficient to carry it. Their use of safeguards, vaults, and locked systems wasn't paranoia. It was trust through preparation. They didn't hide knowledge because they feared others misusing it. They hid it because they believed in the eventual readiness of those who would come after them. Imagine that. A civilization that planned not for its own survival, but for the moral development of future species. They didn't want worship. They didn't want memorials. They wanted others to earn understanding. And yet, for all their restraint, the Old Ones were not passive. There are traces of judgment in their works, systems that deactivate when certain thresholds are crossed, constructs that turn hostile when exposed to selfish psychic energy, even entire webway paths that collapse in the presence of sustained emotional discord. These were not punitive measures. They were corrections, responses to imbalance, built-in feedback systems designed not to punish, but to reset conditions so that learning could continue. One of the most mysterious of these was the so-called trial cycle worlds, planets built as self-contained civilizations with programmed histories, challenges, and progression triggers. Species grown within them would pass through cycles of birth, hardship, learning, and transformation, each time with new conditions, each time reaching further toward a moral or cognitive breakthrough. When the correct threshold was reached, the system would shift, revealing a hidden vault, a new piece of knowledge, or even a webway gate leading out. There is evidence to suggest some species today may have originated in such environments, their earliest histories erased or altered to serve the progression model. If true, it would mean some cultures are still operating within Old One-designed ethical simulations, unaware that their struggles were once part of a lesson. This raises a troubling question. What happens if they never pass? If the moral trajectory stalls? Do the systems shut down? Do they escalate conditions to force progress? Or do they walk away? There are ruins, bleached and dead, where Old One constructs remain, half-active, monitoring silent cities once thriving, now empty. These are the graveyards of failed attempts, not through war, through ethical entropy, because the Old Ones, for all their compassion, had limits. They could not drag life forward. They could only create paths and hope they were followed. This is where their silence speaks loudest. They believed in the potential of others. They believed that life could reach wisdom, even without them. That belief wasn't naive. It was structural. They designed the galaxy around it. They set the stage, then left, not in defeat, but in conviction. Not all their creations honored that hope. Some, like the Necrons, rejected it entirely, choosing immortality and control over uncertainty and trust. Others, like the Krork, fell into stagnation. And still others, perhaps humanity most of all, have only begun to grasp the enormity of what they were invited to be part of. But here is the quiet miracle. The systems still function. The bio-vaults still wait. The echo code still pulses. And in every corner of the galaxy where species struggle toward meaning, where minds question their place in the cosmos, where the urge to understand outweighs the urge to dominate, the legacy of the Old Ones whispers. Not commandments, not ideology, just the faint, persistent signal of a civilization that once believed in something far more enduring than power, the dignity of growth, the morality of patience, and the architect's quiet hope that one day their children, however flawed, would look up from their wars and remember why they were made. Not to rule, not to serve, but to build something better than what came before. The Old Ones are silent, but their philosophy has never stopped unfolding. When you cast a stone into a calm lake, the ripples move outward, clean, symmetrical, and momentary. But if you throw that same stone into a churning sea, the ripples don't vanish. They fracture. They're pulled, twisted, scattered into chaotic motion. No longer clear, no longer whole, but still present, still there. This is how the Old Ones remain in the galaxy today. Not as monuments, not as voices or faces, but as fractured reflections, ripples of intent scattered across the psychic, cultural, and biological debris field that is modern galactic civilization. They are not seen directly, but if you look closely enough, past the blood and smoke, you can see the fingerprints. Even now, in a galaxy consumed by hate, superstition, and madness, the legacy of the Old Ones pulses in the background, half understood, misapplied, distorted, but real. The Eldar, of course, are the most obvious inheritors. Created by the Old Ones in the twilight of their era, the Eldari were designed not only as protectors, but as stabilizers, psychic resonators whose very souls were meant to dampen warp instability. And for a time, they did just that. They were graceful, long-lived, and wise. Their cultures were harmonized with their environments. Their psychic abilities allowed them to interface directly with ancient constructs, interpret encoded wisdom, and, most importantly, remember. But memory can be a double-edged gift. As the Old Ones disappeared, the Eldari began to drift. Their gifts became obsessions. Their pursuit of understanding turned inward. Without guidance, without the counterbalances once provided by their creators or by neighboring uplifted species, the Eldar descended into decadence. They reached too far into the warp, and in doing so, shattered their purpose. Slaanesh was born, their empire died, and yet even in the ruins of craft worlds and the cruelty of Comara, something endures. The shape of the Old One's vision is still there, in the structure of the paths, in the psychic discipline of Farseers, in the wraithbone constructs that sing faintly when aligned to memory, not intact but present. The Eldar are a cracked lens through which the light of the Old Ones still refracts. The Orcs, too, are a legacy, but theirs is a stranger tale. Originally the Krork, engineered as living weapons, not brutes, the Orcs have regressed, their genetic programming degraded by time, war, and their own recursive biology. And yet, despite their chaotic appearance, they still operate on Old One logic, a collective psychic field, innate understanding of complex machinery, a social structure that, though seemingly anarchic, self-regulates in strange, effective ways. They fight, yes, but not blindly. Their wars cleanse infestations, collapse stagnant systems, and reset dying planets. They do not know they are fulfilling a function. They do not know they are a biological tool designed to break things that need to be broken. But they are, and sometimes that is enough. Then there are the Jokero. Almost forgotten, these orange-furred, silent engineers are perhaps the purest functioning example of Old One design still present. They are not rulers, not thinkers in the traditional sense, but technological intuitives, creatures that understand the mechanical and psychic rules of the universe instinctively. Their devices function with impossible elegance. They reverse entropy in small fields. They interface with ancient systems no human or Eldar has ever deciphered, and they refuse to explain. They don't need to, because they are not students of Old One knowledge. They are living extensions of it, but not all reflections are so recognizable. Across the Imperium, fragments of Old One thought have leaked into places where few would expect. The Adepta Sororitas, in their rituals of flame and purification, unknowingly mirror Old One containment protocols designed to prevent warp contagion. The shape of their cathedrals, the cadence of their hymns, both share geometries known to suppress psychic entropy. Coincidence? Or subconscious inheritance passed down through unremembered contact? Within the Mechanicus, a deeper irony waits. They seek knowledge without understanding, obeying a creed of divine technology. And yet, in the deepest vaults of Mars, in Noosphere relics no priest dares open, lie Old One systems, machines still functioning, refusing to obey, because the Mechanicus does not ask in the right way. The Old Ones didn't believe in control, they believed in harmony. The machine god they pray to may be silent, but some of its machinery is still listening, just not to them. And humanity itself. Humanity is the strangest mirror of all. Nowhere is there definitive proof that the Old Ones created mankind. But there are signs, too many to dismiss. Our adaptability, our latent psychic potential, our biological flexibility across environments. These are traits the Old Ones valued and sought to encode into many of their projects. Some scholars, heretical to the Imperium, but preserved in forbidden libraries, believe humanity was a slow-burn experiment left to gestate long after the Old Ones vanished. Not uplifted, not watched, just planted. And perhaps now beginning to wake up. The rise of psychers, the emergence of untapped mental abilities. The Emperor himself, whatever he truly was, may have been the first of us to truly hear the Echo Code, to grasp, if only briefly, the unfinished equation the Old Ones left behind. His great crusade may not have been the forging of a human empire, but an unconscious attempt to complete a message left millennia before. But the tragedy is this. Most civilizations today no longer recognize the Old Ones. They remember them only as myths, spirits, the ancients. Even the Necrons, who once hated them with pure clarity, now struggle to describe them accurately. Time, decay, and propaganda have smothered what little truth remained, and yet their presence has not vanished. Because reflection doesn't need memory, it just needs shape. The ecological balancing instincts of the Tau, the psychic harmonization rituals of primitive Xeno species on death worlds, the recurring dream patterns of rogue psychers who have never met but draw the same impossible glyphs. All of it ripples, broken, dissonant, unacknowledged, but ripples nonetheless. What does it mean? It means the Old Ones did not fail, not entirely. Their systems fell, their species vanished, their artifacts lie buried or rusted. But their ideas, the deepest strata of their intention, survived fragmentation. They seeded continuity through dissonance, trusting that even in collapse, the structure would echo forward. And it has. Not clearly, not perfectly, but enough. Enough that one day, if some convergence happens, if enough fractured pieces of memory, instinct, and understanding collide, the vision they shaped might not return as they left it, but evolve. Not resurrection, adaptation. A new synthesis, born from the collision of all these broken echoes. Until then, the galaxy remains a hall of mirrors, each civilization distorted by its own fear, pain, ambition, each believing it is alone, unique, sovereign. But beneath the distortion, beneath the blood, there is a pattern, a faint chord still playing, not loudly, not clearly, but persistently. The galaxy is still humming with the memory of its oldest architects, and even now the fractured reflections may yet realign. There is a question that echoes louder than all others whenever the name of the Old Ones is whispered. What did they want? Not what they did, not what they built, not what they fought. We know fragments of those stories, evidence etched into worlds, buried in vaults, half remembered by survivors and translated through eons of decay. But desire, intention, final purpose, that is the mystery. That is the silence that endures even now, at the edge of every ruin and beneath every star they once walked beneath. Because if they were as powerful as we believe, if they were as wise, as deliberate, as capable of shaping not only matter but meaning, why did they stop? This chapter does not offer an answer. It does not presume to unravel the unspoken thoughts of a species so ancient and so unlike ourselves. What it does offer is a map of possibilities, drawn not from guesswork or fantasy, but from what the Old Ones left behind, their footprints in biology, structure, and space itself. It is not speculation, it is inference by architecture. Because while the Old Ones are gone, their designs persist. And in those designs we see more than power. We see intention. Let us begin at the broadest scale. The galaxy, as it is today, seems hostile, chaotic, fractured beyond recovery. But if you peel back the layers, if you examine the placement of ancient sites, the corridors of the webway, the distribution of terraformed worlds and seeded life forms, you begin to notice patterns, not random, Not reactive, deliberate. There were corridors laid in the void, avenues of transit, not just physical, but psychic, places where warp storms do not form, or if they do, they dissipate more quickly. These are not coincidences. They are stitched seams, carefully laid to allow for connection without corruption. At the intersection of these seams are worlds, some known, some lost, many of which appear to have been prepared not for the old ones themselves, but for someone else. Worlds with adaptive ecosystems, infrastructure that responds to new sentience, genetic matrices that shift when exposed to particular psychic frequencies. These aren't ruins, they're foundations. And then there's the diversity of uplifted species. We've covered how the old ones created the Eldar, the Krork, the Jokero, and others. But what we've only touched on is the fact that each of these species seems to serve a different function within a broader system. Not hierarchical, not military, but ecological. Not in the sense of environment, but in the sense of interdependency. It's as though the old ones weren't trying to create an empire. They were trying to create a civilizational biosphere, an ecosystem of minds and cultures, each contributing different abilities, temperaments, and perspectives. Some more attuned to logic, others to intuition. Some made to build, others to protect. Some, perhaps even a few we've never encountered, were built to listen, to record, to wait. This model of civilization is profoundly different from anything that exists in the galaxy today. It doesn't strive for dominance. It doesn't rely on central control. It survives by being distributed, flexible, and self-correcting. Like a forest, not a throne. This may have been the old one's final design. Not a ruling caste, not an enduring empire, but a network of life that could operate in harmony, even without its creators. The biovaults, the echo code, the containment systems, even the trial worlds, all of these point toward a singular, patient goal: to give the future a chance to begin again. But not from scratch, from guided chaos, evolution within bounds, struggle tempered with the tools to recover. It would explain their seemingly contradictory behavior. Why build civilizations only to vanish? Why create weapons like the Krork, but deny them leadership? Why lock away knowledge and then leave the keys in the hands of primitives? Because failure was expected. Not desired, but accounted for. The old ones didn't plan to prevent catastrophe. They planned for how life might recover from it. And in that light, their retreat is not a defeat. It is the final phase of a design in which their absence was necessary. Think of a teacher who constructs a labyrinth, but refuses to guide the student through it. Think of a parent who knows they must not solve their child's problems, but must ensure the child has the means to solve them themselves. It's not abandonment. It's belief. And yet, even now, we are not sure if we have passed or failed that test. The galaxy is fractured. The races they shaped are broken or corrupted. The Necrons, their bitterest enemies, now awaken again, sterile and timeless. Chaos blooms in the warp like a tumor, fed by the very psychic potential the old ones once nurtured. And yet, the systems remain. The webway, battered and infiltrated, still holds. The vaults still sleep. The encoded harmonics still pulse in ruins few understand. It may be that this era is the ignition phase, that the system was always designed to trigger a new synthesis once certain conditions were met. Not in any one species, not in any one place, but in convergence, a confluence of fractured knowledge, shared memory, rediscovered truths, humanity with its chaotic potential. The Eldar with their refined perception, the Orcs, the Jokero, the Toe, even the abominable Necrons, each may carry a fragment. The galaxy doesn't need a new empire. It needs a reconstruction of understanding, and that may be what the old ones intended all along. Not survival, but awakening, Not dominance, but balance. A balance earned through suffering, not bestowed by design. A civilization that understands the lessons of failure because it has lived them. A future not crafted by the hands of ancient beings, but by those they left behind when they were ready. In that vision, the Old Ones are not saviors, they are gardeners. And we are the wild growth struggling upward toward the light they hoped we would find. So what did the Old Ones want? Perhaps they wanted this. A galaxy where peace isn't imposed by power, but grown through wisdom. Where knowledge is not hoarded, but shared carefully. Where memory does not dominate the future, but guides it. If such a future is still possible, it will not come through another war. It will not come from another God Emperor, another Citan uprising, another psychic detonation. It will come quietly. From minds that remember without knowing why, from hands that rebuild without being told, from voices that begin to speak, not in domination, but in harmony. And in that moment, whether in 1,000 years or 1,000,000, someone will step into a vault, or awaken a machine, or open a gate long sealed. And a signal will fire, not a warning, not a weapon, but a welcome. You are ready. Begin. The last design of the Old Ones was never about themselves. It was about what comes next.